single market deal and the guaranteeing of rights and protections, rather than go back to the alternative that she's been threatening everybody with for months and months, which was to crash out without any deal whatsoever.
Prime Minister.
Last night the House did vote to reject no deal, but that cannot be the end of the story. The only way, the right honourable gentleman says, of course not. I think that's the first time he's actually accepted that you can't just vote to reject no deal. You have to vote for a deal. Otherwise, you leave with no deal. So far, he has opposed everything this government has put forward in relation to a deal. And he said previously he will reject any deal that the government puts on the table. Will he now? He says it's Prime Minister's questions, but people want to know his position as well. Will he ensure that if this government comes back with a revised deal that ensures we don't leave with no deal, he will actually support it?
It really is time, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister acknowledge she's got to move on from the red lines she's put down in the first place. And she doesn't acknowledge that in answers to my questions or indeed anybody else's. Mr. Speaker, our responsibility is to bring people together. Whether they vote... Mr. Speaker, we are the Houses of Parliament, we are the House of Commons, we do represent the entire country, and the point I'm making is we should bring people together whether they voted leave or remain. And indeed, I look forward to meeting the Prime Minister to discuss a solution that could, in my view, unite the country. Changes to the backstop alone will not be sufficient. Businesses and trade unions are very clear that any solution must involve a customs union and the strongest possible deal with a single market to avoid the damage of no deal. The Prime Minister may have possibly temporarily united her party, but is she willing, Mr. Speaker, is...
Order. Mr. Ellis. You were at one time a barrister of one rank or another in the courts. There is no way that you would have been allowed to shout from a sedentary position in that way, and the judge would have ruled you out of order. I don't know whether that's why you stopped practising law and came into Parliament. Behave yourself, young man. You can do so much better when you try. Jeremy Corbyn.
Speaker, as I was saying before, I was so rudely interrupted. The Prime Minister may have succeeded in temporarily uniting her very divided party. But, Mr. Speaker, is she willing to make compromises necessary that are more important, and that is to unite the country on a going forward to secure jobs and living standards right across the UK?
Prime Minister.
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, he's a fine one to talk about coming together when it was only last night that he agreed to actually meet me to talk about these issues. And he said he's time and time again he's told me to listen to the views of the House. He's just stood up and said the backstop is not the only issue in the withdrawal agreement. Last night the House voted by a majority to say that the issue that needed to be addressed was the backstop. So he needs to listen to the House and to recognise that. And his proposal last night, he put forward a proposal last night which referenced the customs union, the single market, and his proposal was rejected by this House. But I'll tell him what this government has been doing. Over the last week, we've been getting more teachers into schools. We've been ensuring we're giving more money to councils. We won a majority on Brexit. What did he manage? His Brexit plan was voted down. He opposed ending free movement, and he won't rule out a second referendum. He's no plan for Brexit, no good plan for our economy, and no plan for our country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First-time buyer numbers, which collapsed under the last Labour government, are now at a 10-year high thanks to initiatives like Help to Buy and the first-time buyer stamp duty cut. But there are still many people in their 20s and 30s who want to buy their own home. Will the Prime Minister join me in asking local authorities to use their existing powers when they grant planning consents to make sure that as many properties as possible are designated as starter homes or discount market sales homes to help those people in their 20s and 30s realise the dream of home ownership?
My honourable friend raises an important issue, not only in pointing out the very good news that we see that 10-year high in the number of first-time buyers, but also the opportunities that are available for local authorities to provide for this. And we obviously are clear that the planning system has a key role in delivering more affordable homes, and the National Planning Policy Framework, revised last year, was central to this. It includes a wider definition of affordable housing, and local authorities are expected to consider the new definition, which includes what my honourable friend has referenced, starter homes and discounted market sales homes, to identify the types of affordable housing their communities need. And there's an expectation that major developments will make a minimum of 10% of homes available for affordable ownership, including starter homes and discounted market sales homes. So we've made good progress on first-time buyers. There's more for us to do, and this government is doing it.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 weeks ago, the Prime Minister told this House to vote down this deal in the hope of going back to Brussels and negotiating an alternative deal. No such alternative deal exists. Yet last night, she told the House she will go back to Brussels and seek an alternative arrangement. So what is it? Has the Prime Minister inadvertently misled the House, or has this government's incompetence reached a whole new level?
Prime Minister.
A very simple fact that the right honourable gentleman appears to have omitted in what he's saying is that the deal was brought to the House, and the House of Commons rejected that deal. Therefore, we look to say what can be changed, what can we take back to Brussels, what can we fight for to ensure that the deal can get the support of this House. But I'd also like to take the opportunity. I was going to respond to the right honourable gentleman's point of order last night, but unfortunately, when I looked, he'd left, I think, to go and do a Sky News interview, because I have to say to him, I want to just confirm absolutely the commitment of this government to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And the remarks the right honourable gentleman made last night in relation to that were frankly irresponsible.
Mr. Speaker, the only thing that is irresponsible are the actions of this Prime Minister.
Order. The right honourable gentleman has a right to be heard. The public would expect him to be heard, and he will be heard. And attempts to shout him down are not just rude, they are irresponsible, they are undemocratic, and they should certainly not have the sanction of anyone who sits on the Treasury bench. Stop it. It's low grade, it's useless, and it won't work. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That was a graceless response from the Prime Minister, who is acting with sheer irresponsibility. And I have to say in her answer, what she demonstrated is, here are my principles, if you don't like them, you can have some more. Mr. Speaker, last night a majority of Scottish MPs rejected Brexit. The Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly, and this House...
Order. Stop it. It's utterly irresponsible, chanting in the background. Let the right honourable gentleman ask his question and the Prime Minister answer it. That is what the public would expect. Ian Blackford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly and this House of Commons has rejected the Prime Minister's deal. The UK Government told Scotland in 2014 being part of the UK meant continued EU membership. The UK Government told us we'd be part of a family of equal nations. Prime Minister, Scotland wants to stay in the EU. We are scunnered by this government ignoring Scotland. Prime Minister, do you accept that you've promised Scotland everything, you've delivered nothing?
Prime Minister.
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, Scotland is part of the United Kingdom. It voted in 2014 to stay part of the United Kingdom. the United Kingdom will be leaving the European Union. But if the right honourable gentleman wants to talk about the impact of Scotland in the future, perhaps he should look at the latest figures that came out just this morning on exports. Over 60% of Scotland's exports go to the rest of the UK. That's more than Scotland's trade with the rest of the world, and over 3 times more than with the rest of the European Union. And yet he represents a party that wants to erect a border between Scotland and England. The biggest threat to the future of Scotland is sitting on those benches.
Sir Geoffrey Clifton Brown.
Mr. Speaker, there is a clear choice between remaining in the customs union or a fully functioning UK independent trade policy. Does my right honourable friend think it is time that the Leader of the Opposition alters his red lines, repeated twice in its question time, accept the will of the British people and allow businesses to thrive in a post-Brexit world by having a free trade policy?
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend is absolutely right about what we are aiming to ensure that we get from leaving the European Union, which is that ability to have that independent trade policy. That is so important for us as we leave the European Union. Yes, I want to have a good trade relationship with the EU, but I also want to ensure that we are able to have an independent trade policy with those trade deals around the world, and that this country should be a champion for free trade around the world. That's the way, not only to enhance our economy and to bring jobs to this country and enhance our prosperity, but actually that will be of benefit for countries around the world, including some of the countries whose economies do need to be helped and improved. Some of the people who are some of the poorest in the world will be helped by those trade arrangements. That's what we are going to deliver. That's our commitment to the British people, and as my honourable friend says, it delivers on the result of the referendum.
Andy Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent Lynn Sherman, who has 2 terminal illnesses, reapplied for her PIP on the 19th of September, but did not receive a home visit assessment until the 6th of January.
Shame.
She has still not received a decision on her claim. Does the Prime Minister consider it fair or sensible that in addition to losing her benefit, Ms Sherman has also lost her blue badge, her bus pass and her carers?
Prime Minister.
The honourable gentleman has raised a specific constituency case, and the honourable gentleman has raised a specific constituency case, and I will ask the relevant department to look into the details of that case.
Andrew Percy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 12th of July last year, my constituents took their son Jack to Leeds Children's Hospital for surgery for craniosynostosis. The surgery went well, but after that care he declined post-surgery. His parents raised concerns as he declined so much by the 16th of July. A nurse raised concerns regarding sepsis. Jack continued to be treated for gastroenteritis. On the next day, Jack died of overwhelming sepsis. This is now the subject, sadly, of a coroner's inquest. But what my constituents want is to ensure that this never happens again to another set of parents. Jack was just 3 days short of his 2nd birthday. The hospital has since then introduced an early warning system for paediatric sepsis, but that came too late for Jack. Can my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, assure me that she will do everything in her powers to ensure that no other parent has to go through what my constituents have been through?
Prime Minister.
First of all, can I say to my honourable friend that I'm sure the whole House will join me in sending our deepest condolences to the family and friends of Jack. A terrible tragedy that has occurred, and the loss of such a young life. Can I also say that we recognise, as indeed I'm sure our honourable friend, the member for Dudley South, will confirm, that sepsis is a devastating condition. And it is important that the NHS carries on developing its programme of work on recognising sepsis and improving outcomes. I know NHS England and NHS Improvement are working urgently with the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health to establish a single England-wide paediatrics early warning system to improve the recognition of and response of healthcare services to children and young people. Nothing that we can do, obviously, can bring Jack back or compensate for the devastating impact on his family. But I can reassure my honourable friend, and I hope he will be able to reassure his constituents, that we're going to continue to do all we can to improve the care for those with this devastating condition.
Owen Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will know that there is a rising tide of racism in our country. Since she came to office, race-hate crime has increased by 100% to 72,000 separate attacks last year. What is happening to our country on her watch?
Prime Minister.
Can I say to the honourable gentleman that when I was Home Secretary, I took measures to ensure that we improved the recording of hate crime, because actually, no, we didn't have a full picture of what was happening. My right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, has recently reviewed and revised our hate crime strategy. But the point underlying what the honourable gentleman has said, which is that none of us should accept hate crime. We should all be very clear from this House that there is no place for hate crime in our society, and wherever we see racism, in whatever form, we should all take action to eradicate it.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In her discussions with EU leaders, will the Prime Minister be making it crystal clear that this government stands firmly behind all of its commitments under the Belfast Good Friday Agreement?
Minister.
Very happy to give my honourable friend that absolute assurance and commitment. We stand fully behind our commitments under the Belfast and Good Friday Agreement, and that everything we do will be in the light of those commitments.
Tracy Brabin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Batley and Spen is a community made up of small towns and villages, and buses are a valued and essential service. So I'm sure the Prime Minister will sympathise with my constituents' anger at the recent cuts to services by Arriva announced this week. So much so that commutes are thrown into chaos, people can't get to the shops, and one head teacher told me that they were concerned how their pupils would actually get to school. Doesn't the Prime Minister agree with me that people are more important than profit? And isn't it time to invest in bus services after years of cuts and bring them under public control?
Minister.
Can I say to the honourable lady, we recognise the importance that buses play in local communities, and that's why we spend £250 million every year to keep fares down and maintain an extensive network, and that benefits people up and down the country. And we particularly put money into supporting free bus travel for older and disabled people, because we recognise how particularly important buses are to vulnerable people. Now, we're looking at what we can do further to improve access for people with disabilities, but we have been putting money in to ensure that there remains an extensive bus network which is a benefit to local communities.
David Duquette.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Last night this House voted, a majority of this House voted in favour of a deal. A deal to deliver on the democratic will of the people of the United Kingdom and to leave the EU. Will my right honourable friend continue to stand firm in the next phase of negotiations against the fishing nations of the EU and their vain attempts to maintain guaranteed common access to our waters?
Can I say to my honourable friend, I can give him absolute commitment that I will do that. Leaving the common fisheries policy, becoming an independent coastal state is so important to this country to enable us to enhance and give opportunities to fishing communities around the United Kingdom. I recognise it's particularly important in Scotland, but there are fishing communities around the whole of the UK who will benefit from us becoming an independent coastal state. And I'm very clear, our position is there, we have that agreement, and it's not up for renegotiation.
Ian Paisley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will be aware of the report by Sir John Gillan into the laws and procedures around serious sexual offences in Northern Ireland. A very serious preliminary report which already reveals that there's a declining conviction rate in Northern Ireland, that we have the longest delays for getting cases to trial, and those that want to go to trial, there's a 40% dropout. These are serious issues, and I'm wondering what the Prime Minister is going to be able to do to ensure that any law
changes that Sir John Gillan recommends will be able to be implemented in Northern Ireland?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman that obviously this is a very serious issue, and it's something I understand the judiciary in Northern Ireland and the devolved justice authorities are keeping under close and active consideration. Of course, as the honourable gentleman knows, policing and justice is a devolved matter in Northern Ireland, as is the length of custodial sentences. Now, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, in recently passing the Executive Formation and Exercise of Functions Bill, enables departments to continue to take decisions in the public interest to ensure the continued operation of public services, but that is not and cannot be a replacement for a devolved government. And I think the example the honourable gentleman has given is yet another reason why it's important for us all to work to get the devolved administration back up and running.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will appreciate that the government is spending over 50% more per head in real terms in education than in the year 2000. Achieving much better results, might I add, Mr. Speaker. However, there are still some challenges with resources and funding in many areas across Hitchin and Harpenden, especially in small rural schools. Would the Prime Minister commit to special consideration for education in the upcoming spending review, because I believe that this would command widespread support across the House.
Prime Minister.
To my honourable friend, I think the Chancellor was listening to the remarks and the comments that my honourable friend made in his question in relation to funding. It is absolutely right, as my honourable friend says, that we have been putting more money into schools, and it's also right that we see more children, 1.9 million more children now, in good or outstanding schools than in 2010. We will, of course, be looking carefully across all elements of public expenditure when we come to the spending review. But as I said to my honourable friend, I'm sure the Chancellor has heard the lobbying that my honourable friend has indulged in his question in relation to this matter, particularly for small rural schools.
Stephen Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unlike this government, John Lewis has never knowingly undersold Portsmouth. But last week, partners announced they're closing Knighton Lee, a much-loved store in the heart of my community since 1865. And that's just one example. Retailer after retailer, store after store, job after job. When will the government finally bring our high streets back from the brink?
Minister.
Well, obviously, I recognise this is a concerning time for the employees at Knighton Lee in Southsea. Obviously, it's a commercial decision for the company to take. We will be ensuring that the Department for Work and Pensions and Job Centre Plus will work with the company to understand the level of employee support required. But I have to say to the honourable gentleman that if he is worried about jobs in his constituency, the policies that would cause most damage to jobs in his constituency are the policies of the Labour Party and his Labour front bench.
Douglas Ross.
Mr. Speaker, last week SNP-led Moray Council announced a number of devastating cuts to local services, many of which will impact young people, from closing libraries and swimming pools to ending the Active Schools programme and increasing the fees on music tuition. These young people are affected, while the highest paid senior managers in the council are not. So will my right honourable friend agree with me that the SNP in Moray should focus on services rather than managers, and call on the Scottish Government to deliver a fairer funding deal for Moray?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend, of course, the UK Government has increased the block grant that is going to the Scottish Government next year. So decisions on cutting budgets are a matter of priority for the SNP rather than necessity. Extra money has been given to them. It's a question of where they want to put that money and what they put as a priority. And I think it's time that the SNP empowered local government in Scotland rather than hoarding power at Holyrood.
Mr. Stephen Hepburn.
Next week is World Cancer Day. Last week, I regret that St Clair's Hospice in Jarrow closed through funding difficulties. Would the Prime Minister use her officers to facilitate a meeting between me and the relevant Health Minister to see if we can secure and ensure health care for the terminally ill in the future in the Jarrow constituency?
Prime Minister.
I say to the honourable gentleman, I will ensure that the relevant minister meets with him and addresses this issue with him.
Rachel McLean.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. With record numbers of women in the workplace now,
more and more women will experience the symptoms of perimenopause or menopause while they're at work. And, Mr. Speaker, often these symptoms are not well understood by the general population, and they include much more than just hot flushes and night sweats. So will the Prime Minister please join my campaign, which calls on employers to update their health and wellbeing policies so that women can get full information and proper support so they can continue contributing at work?
Prime Minister.
I say to thank my honourable friend for raising this issue, because obviously this is an issue that I think many members across this House will recognise and recognise as an important issue. And we recognise the difficulties that women going through the menopause face. We are encouraging employers to adopt menopause-friendly policies such as flexible working. We're giving women information about healthy lifestyles that may help to improve their experience of the menopause. And I would certainly, as my honourable friend is doing, encourage all employers to take reasonable steps, including those that my honourable friend has referenced, to support employees so that they can indeed be able to continue to carry out their jobs and contribute to our economy in the way that they have done so far.
Jack Dramey.
Prime Minister, we are 58 days away from a cliff. If we plunge over into a precipice of abyss, our country will be a poorer country in every sense of the word. Last night, this House voted that there can be no question of a no-deal Brexit. Will the Prime Minister honour the will of Parliament and rule out a no-deal Brexit? Because to proceed with a no-deal Brexit would not only impoverish our country, it would be contemptuous of Parliament.
Prime Minister.
The gentleman is right that Parliament last night voted to reject no deal. What Parliament also voted for last night was to say that it wanted to leave the European Union with a deal, and it identified what was necessary to change in the deal in order to enable that to happen and for the support of this House to be given to a deal. And that's where we should be focusing, because we can only ensure that we avoid no deal by having a deal, by agreeing a deal, and by this House supporting a deal and voting for a deal.
Simon Clark.
May I commend my right honourable friend for her commitment yesterday to return to Brussels and reopen the text of the withdrawal agreement. That's the right thing to do, and people in Middlesbrough South and East Cleveland will welcome it because they want to leave with a good deal for our country. Can I commend the compromise proposed by my honourable friend, the member for North West Hampshire, which I think is excellent and has every chance of success in uniting this Parliament and this country behind a good exit?
Prime Minister.
Say to my honourable friend that obviously there was a very clear message from the House last night as to what needs to happen in terms of returning to Brussels, but also we're engaging positively with the proposals that, as he said, our honourable friend, the member for North West Hampshire, and others have put forward in relation to dealing with this issue of the backstop.
Luke Pollard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Next week marks 5 years since the train line at Dawlish was washed away in storms. 5 years on, that train line remains fragile. We need money, not more press releases. Can the Prime Minister help unblock the £300 million upgrade that the DfT is sitting on and use the anniversary next week to help the South West, Plymouth and the rest of the far South West keep our train line open and stop it being fragile and precarious?
Prime Minister.
Obviously, passengers do expect better, and I understand that from the Department of Transport, the first phase of work to protect the seawall at Dawlish began in November with essential repairs to the breakwaters, and that's part of the £15 million wider investment to make the railway at Dawlish and Teignmouth more resilient to extreme weather. And can I just reassure the honourable gentleman that world-leading engineers have been carrying out those detailed ground investigation to develop that long-term solution for protecting the railway in a way that minimises disruption for passengers, and Network Rail will be reporting soon on how they will deliver these. But I'm absolutely clear delivering this improvement to the South West transport infrastructure is a national priority. It is essential for unlocking the region's economic prosperity and jobs, and that's why we're giving it the focus we are.
Maggie through.
Mr. Speaker, Copenhagen Junior School in my constituency has increased its proportion of pupils attaining the required level of Key Stage 2 standards from 35% to an amazing 67% over the last year. Will my right honourable friend join with me in congratulating the pupils, the teachers and the head, Simon Robinson, and 13 other primary schools across Erewash for all improving their Key Stage 2 performances?
Prime Minister.
Honourable friend, I'm delighted to hear of the increased performance at Cotman Hay Junior School. We are seeing the education of children being improved, regardless of where they live or their background, so that they can get the education they need to fulfil their potential. I'm happy to join my honourable friend in congratulating the pupils and the staff of that particular school, but also of the other schools she's referenced across her Erewash constituency who have seen these improvements. These are important for the future of those children.
Marsha de Cordova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday evening, MPs from across the House voted against a no deal, an outcome that the TUC warns would be devastating for jobs and which the CBI this morning says businesses will be speeding up preparations for. The people hit hardest by a no deal will be the ordinary people in Battersea and across the country. So will the Prime Minister finally listen to this House, to trade unions, to businesses and to our constituents and categorically rule out a no deal?
Minister.
To the Honourable Lady, the House rejected no deal last night, but I hope that she, when the time comes, will play her part in avoiding no deal and will vote for a deal.
Mark Harper.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister knows that I want to make sure we leave the European Union on the 29th of March. She knows, regretfully, I couldn't support her deal 2 weeks ago because of the backstop, its impact on our relationship between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and trapping us potentially in a customs union. I welcome the fact the House gave a clear majority yesterday to renegotiating the backstop. If she can deliver that, then I will vote for her deal, and I'm confident that will be a sustainable majority to get it through this House and the legislation. So can I ask my right honourable friend, tell the European Union there is a majority in this House for that deal to get us out of the European Union on good terms, and I would ask my colleagues to give the Prime Minister space. They're not going to crumble tomorrow. We're going to have to hold our nerve, and we can be successful.
Prime Minister.
Can I say to my right honourable friend, he is absolutely right about the importance of the vote that took place last night, because that vote, agreeing what it was necessary to change in the withdrawal agreement in order to achieve a majority across this House, winning that vote with a majority, gave a very clear message to the European Union that actually a deal can go through this House, but it has to be a deal that recognises the concerns that the House has expressed across the whole of this House in relation to the backstop. That is what I'm going to be going and fighting for, the change that this House has been very clear it wants to see in the future. And then, as my right honourable friend says, I'm confident we can see a sustainable and substantial majority across this House for leaving with the deal.
McDonough.
Mr. Speaker, Anna is a carer for the elderly. She lived with her girls in a flat above Barclays Bank. Because her husband left, she cannot pay the rent without claiming universal credit. She does not have a guarantor, so Barclays agents are evicting her. Another private landlord evicting a hard-working family on universal credit. Will the Prime Minister intervene and ask Barclays to grant her a tenancy so that her girls are not just two more in the 130,000 children in this country in temporary accommodation?
Prime Minister.
To the Honourable Lady, that obviously, again, like one of her honourable friends, she's raised an individual constituency case, and the details of that individual constituency case, I will ask the relevant minister to look into that case and be in. Well, she's asking me to take a position purely on the question that she has asked me. I am asking the Minister in the relevant department to actually look into the case and to be able to assess that case and to respond to the Honourable Lady.
Nigel Huddleston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This afternoon we shall be debating the Crime Bill, which, amongst other things, will facilitate the cross-border exchange of data, which will enable us to investigate crimes such as terrorism and paedophilia. is it the responsibility of all of us in this House to wholeheartedly support that bill?
Yes.
Prime
Can I say
Minister.
to my honourable friend, absolutely, yes, this is a very important bill in the impact that it will have. I'm sure everybody across this whole House wants to ensure that we can deal with terrorism, with paedophilia and indeed with other organised crime. Exchange of data is an important way of doing that, and I hope everybody will see the importance of the support for that.
Mr Nigel Dodds.
Mr Speaker, in recent days we have heard the Irish Prime Minister talk about bringing his troops up to the border in the event of a no deal. We have heard the Irish Deputy Foreign Minister talking of people jumping out of windows. Isn't this highly reckless talk, extremely dangerous in the present circumstances? That sort of rhetoric should be toned down and instead focus on what Michel Barnier said the other day, that even in the event of a no deal, we would sit down and find operational ways to have checks and controls away from the border. Isn't that the way forward? And it blows a hole in the entire concept of this backstop.
Minister.
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, obviously it is important that I'll be speaking to the Taoiseach later today, and it is important for us to work with the Government of Ireland on the arrangements that will be in place in the future. We obviously have sent a clear message from this House about what needs to happen in relation to the backstop, but we retain our commitment to no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, and look to working with the Government of Ireland and with the European Union to ensure that we can all maintain our commitments under the Belfast and Good Friday Agreement and that commitment to no hard border on the island of Ireland.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Last Sunday we commemorated Holocaust Memorial Day, when we remembered the darkest period in Europe's history. Will my right honourable friend join with me in thanking the Holocaust Educational Trust, its youth ambassadors and the incredible survivors who give their personal testimony to young people so that they will remember what the ultimate destination of racial hatred and anti-Semitism truly is.
Prime Minister.
He's absolutely right to raise the excellent work that the Holocaust Educational Trust does. And the youth ambassadors. I've met some of these youth ambassadors who have understood the importance of learning the lesson from the Holocaust, understood the importance of acting against anti-Semitism wherever it occurs, and indeed of wider racial hatred. And also, as my honourable friend says, the survivors from the Holocaust, who have given their time to ensuring that nobody is in any doubt about where man's inhumanity to man can lead. They have done a really important job, and I pay tribute to them and to their continuing work. It's important that we all recognise the terrible things that can happen when we let anti-Semitism occur. We should all be fighting against anti-Semitism wherever it occurs.
Finally, Liam Byrne.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In the cold of Sunday, Kane Walker was found dead on the pavements of Birmingham. He was 31, and he became one of over 2,600 homeless people to have lost their lives in the last 5 years. When will the Prime Minister recognise the scale of homelessness today is a moral emergency, and we cannot wait until 2027 for this government to end homelessness for good, when we need action now?
Prime Minister.
First of all, say to the honourable gentleman, we all want to ensure that everybody in this country can have a safe and secure roof over their head, that nobody has to be on the streets sleeping rough. That's why we're putting money into this. We've taken a number of initiatives like Housing First, which are already showing benefits in helping people who otherwise would be homeless and could end up on the streets in having a home and dealing with the issues that ensure they're able to stay in that home. This is something that we recognise the importance of, and that's why we're putting money into it, that's why we're acting, that's why we are ensuring that action is being taken across the country to deal with this.
Thank you. Order. Urgent question, Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Home Secretary to make a statement on the territorial extent of the draft domestic abuse bill and the consequences of this for victims of violence across the UK.
Mr. Speaker, the landmark draft domestic abuse bill we published last week will help transform the response to these horrific crimes. It is aimed at supporting victims and their families and pursuing offenders to stop the cycle of violence. The bill will cement a statutory definition of domestic abuse that extends beyond violence to include emotional, psychological and economic abuse. The bill does not create new criminal offences in relation to domestic abuse because these offences are already settled laws, such as Section 18 GBH, coercive and controlling behaviour, and even, in the saddest of cases, murder. These offences are all devolved, but in line with existing criminal law, the provisions of the draft bill expand to England and Wales only. Contrary to the suggestion there may be in the honourable member's question, there has been no change in the territorial application of the bill compared with the proposals in the government's consultation published last spring. This was made clear in the consultation paper and reflects the fact that the subject matter of the draft bill is devolved in Scotland and Northern Ireland. We are currently in discussion with the Scottish Government and the Northern Ireland Department of Justice about whether they wish to extend any of the provisions of the bill to Scotland and Northern Ireland respectively. We are seeking to establish a joint committee of both houses as soon as practicable to undertake pre-legislative scrutiny of the draft bill, and I would encourage the honourable member and indeed all honourable members to contribute to that process.
Stella Creasy.
Domestic abuse affects communities in every nation in the UK. Yet last week, after 2.5 years of waiting, the government published a draft bill that only takes action in England and Wales. Mr. Speaker, I'm asking this question not to debate the nature of devolution, but to ask why this bill has been restricted when from the outset what was promised was very different. Indeed, the original consultation spoke of recognising insecure immigration status may impact on a victim's decision to seek help. We know that migrant women are much less likely to seek help because they fear deportation. Now, some may point to other immigration legislation going through this place, but that doesn't include anything on this issue either. So this bill would have been the vehicle for helping those victims. But immigration is not a devolved matter. The then Home Secretary and the now Welfare Secretary has also rightly recognised that financial destitution can hold women in abusive relationships. This bill ought to be welcomed because it does contain much that regards action in the courts and an independent conditioner. But because it is restricted, it doesn't address these critical areas of policy. Why then, after 2.5 years, would the government do this? The Sunday Times this weekend provided the answer with the confirmation that the bill had been vetted by the Cabinet Office, that the government feared making this bill UK-wide because of the DUP. Why, Mr. Speaker? Because this bill is also about implementing the UN Convention on Violence Against Women, a convention the UN has said we are breaching right now because citizens in Northern Ireland are denied the right to choose not to continue an unwanted pregnancy. Mr. Speaker, today a brave young woman, just 28, Sarah Hewitt, is taking our government to court to vindicate her human rights. She suffered a fatal fetal abnormality, but as a resident of Northern Ireland was denied the right to an abortion at home, so had, as 28 women a week currently do, to travel to England. Now, last June, the Supreme Court told this government this situation breached the rights of UK women, but because of a technicality, wasn't compelled to make them act. This bill, from the outset, could have been the remedy for it. But this weekend's revelations show that this government has drafted this bill not with the victims of domestic violence in mind, but their partners in the coalition. So too, this bill talks about domestic abuse protection orders, which are supposed to have effect across the whole of the UK. Yet there is no clarity, given the restriction on scope, how the government intends to compel Scotland or Northern Ireland to act on them. Given the original consultation talked of working with the Northern Ireland Executive, these problems are clearly of their own making and a direct response to the calls for equal rights for the women of Northern Ireland. So given this mess, can I ask the Minister to confirm which of the DUP coordination committees this decision was taken at? Because it isn't minuted in the notes from July 2017 to Christmas 2018. The power to veto legislation affecting all of the UK isn't in the Confidence and Supply Agreement, which I note was updated on the 19th of December. So can the Minister explain how this decision to restrict the bill for this purpose was made, and what the implications are now for the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, who has direct responsibility for upholding the human rights of the people of Northern Ireland? Can the Minister also explain why migrant women, those on low incomes and abusive relationships, should pay such a price? Can she stop hiding behind devolution and say sorry to Sarah Hewitt for making her relive the trauma of what has happened to her all over again just because the government needs those 10 votes of the DUP to stay in power? We saw that last night, and I've no doubt we'll see it again. But this bill shows the human consequences for women across the UK of the Confidence Supply Agreement. I know members across this House want to see action on domestic violence. I know that those restrictions in Northern Ireland will trouble many, but not just the women in our constituencies across the whole UK. So will the Minister commit, given this is a draft bill, to going back to the drawing board and coming up with a bill that can protect every victim across the UK? Minister, fight us fair and square on abortion rights in this place, not through backroom deals and bargaining, unless it will take a rape victim having to come to court to make this government do the right thing and not block this change. Put DV, not the DUP, first.
Home should be a place of safety and love. And yet for 2 million people in this country a year, that is not the case. That is why we are bringing this bill, this unprecedented bill, to try to help the victims of domestic abuse. Now, the honourable member has quite rightly highlighted the fact it applies at the moment only to England and Wales. And the reason for that, as I set out in my initial statement, is that the underlying offences which would support prosecutions of domestic abuse are devolved. Section 18 GBH, coercive controlling behaviour, and the raft of offences that can help support prosecutions. But we've not rested on our laurels. I have written to the Scottish Government and to the Northern Irish Department to ask them whether they will legislate in their own territories to replicate this across the country. I'm delighted to say that the Scottish Government is looking at its own measures. I'm sure my honourable colleagues for the Scottish National Party will have their own thoughts on devolved matters and the UK Parliament respecting that. But I must, I'm afraid, bring the honourable member back to the central subject of the bill, which is this is about tackling domestic abuse. I know it's something she feels strongly about. It's something that many members across the House feel strongly about. We must focus on this bill. Please, let's not have taunts thrown across the dispatch box. Let's work together to ensure that this bill is in a good state when it comes back to the House and is introduced formally. And she, at the end, asked me about bringing this back for scrutiny. We have said from the very beginning that this is a draft piece of legislation and it will be scrutinised by a joint committee of both houses. We anticipate that taking about 12 weeks, and once the committee has produced its recommendations, we will of course look at those very carefully before we introduce the full bill. And I would just say, whatever she may have read in the paper on Sunday, don't believe everything you read in the paper. I just think we really do have to remember the people that we are trying to help through this bill. And I have to say, I've been delighted at the cross-party consensus on this bill. Let's work together so that we stop this cycle of violence and we help the victims of domestic abuse.
Anna Soubry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I commend the Minister and indeed the Government on this bill. It's a very good bill, and as I say, it's to be highly commended. However, I very much share the concerns of the Honourable Member for Walthamstow. I am gravely concerned that this is, in effect, a way of stopping what should be happening, which is a fundamental reform of the laws in Northern Ireland so that women in Northern Ireland have exactly the same rights as women in my constituency. Can I ask the Minister this? And forgive me, Mr. Speaker, because I genuinely don't know the answer. Are there any civil remedies in this bill? Because if there are, then I'm afraid the Minister's response falls absolutely flat, because civil remedies are relevant across all of the United Kingdom, and therefore the scope of this bill immediately needs to be changed.
I'm extremely grateful to right honourable friend, for raising this, and I know how passionately she, in her time, not just in this place, but in her previous career, has worked to help the victims of domestic abuse. In relation to her concerns, I note her concerns. And she knows that I too have my own concerns, although this is not for today. And I'm sure she joins me in urging all of those people who can make a difference in Northern Ireland to get around the table so that they can represent and they can deal with this in the devolved administration. In terms of civil remedies, we've sought to consolidate the range of orders that are in existence at the moment, which can be very, very confusing, not just for victims but other professionals involved in safeguarding victims, that we're seeking to consolidate the range of orders available to protect victims in domestic abuse protection orders. They apply across the courts, so family as well as civil courts, but also criminal courts. And so on that particular issue, I will happily take that away. But I have to say my understanding does not accord with hers, but I'm very happy to take that away.
Carolyn Harris.
As a Welsh MP, I have every confidence that the Welsh Labour Government is working towards delivering an excellent strategy around support for victims of domestic violence. I have no doubt the same is true in Scotland. I totally respect the concept of devolution when it works. But with the absence of Stormont, victims in Northern Ireland will only see the progress being made in other parts of the UK as further evidence of where they are falling behind in support services and legislation available to them. We already know that in Northern Ireland they have no coercive control law and no stalking law, and the current controversy over the legality of abortion rumbles on. We need the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland to take firmer action so that we can see a return to devolved government. The good people of Northern Ireland deserve the same rights as everyone else in the UK, and currently they are not getting this. They are not protected by a devolved government because of Stormont suspension. Even in today's Northern Ireland question, we have been calling for the return of devolved institutions. We believe that support and services for victims of domestic violence in Northern Ireland are best made in Northern Ireland. But after 2 years of no government, the situation is stagnant. The people of Northern Ireland are suffering the effects of this political hiatus, none more so than the victims of domestic violence, as their voices reverberate in an echo chamber. I know that no MP in this place would believe the politics and strategies that support our constituents should not be afforded to the people of Northern Ireland. And one of the most notable issues is that of abortion. Human rights issues are not devolved to the Northern Ireland Executive, and as such, issues around women's productive health are the responsibility of this Home Secretary and other relevant ministers. Decisions on the provision of public services, legislation and support for the Northern Ireland need to be reached urgently. And if there is no likelihood of Stormont reconvening very shortly, then this government needs to take responsibility to protect and support the domestic abuse victims of Northern Ireland.
Well, as always, I'm extremely grateful to the honourable member, indeed my honourable friend. She and I are agreeing furiously on the hope and aspiration that those who can make a difference and who can express the wishes of the residents of Northern Ireland, which I hope we all accept, may not agree with our individual viewpoints on, for example, abortion, but that is why that particular topic is devolved. And I'm sure we all, and I know the honourable member does, we all encourage them to get back round the table to sort this as well as many, many other issues. But again, I gently remind colleagues this is about domestic abuse, and although Sadly, some abortions may be as a result of an intimate abusive relationship. Not all abortions fall into that category, and I'm just very keen that we try and focus on the victims of domestic abuse in this bill and our scrutiny of this bill, because they are the people we really are trying to help with the passing of this particular piece of legislation.
Fiona Bruce.
Let's call this out for what it is. It is part of an orchestrated campaign to alter abortion laws in Northern Ireland and here, and to replace those laws with extreme proposals for which there is no public appetite whatsoever. Does the Minister agree that it is highly inappropriate for such campaigners to hijack the domestic abuse bill in this way, undermining a bill to support victims of domestic abuse and their families, and that it is equally inappropriate to interfere in a devolved matter, a matter that's been devolved for almost 100 years, that would set a dangerous constitutional precedent, a precedent of interference that would undermine the Good Friday Agreement itself?
Well, the Honourable Lady, I thank her for her question, demonstrates the range and the depth and the passion with which views are held across the House on this topic of abortion. And I'm grateful to her for reminding us that this bill is, as it says in the title, it's a draft domestic abuse bill. I very much note her observations about the political structure in Northern Ireland. And again, I'm not sure this urgent question is the fora in which any differences or changes to that are going to happen. But I'm grateful to her for her question, and I think again it just underlines the point we've got to keep in mind the subject matter of this bill, which is we're trying to tackle domestic abuse.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The situation in Northern Ireland as regards women's rights, particularly abortion rights, is deplorable and it requires to be addressed. However, this bill could never have been UK-wide because civil and criminal justice are devolved to Scotland. And indeed, last year, Scotland passed its own Domestic Abuse Act, which has already significantly strengthened statutory definitions and protections around domestic violence, for example, by recognising the offence of coercive control. I think there's much to be welcomed in the UK Government's bill, but I'm pleased to hear that they're putting it through pre-legislative scrutiny, which will hopefully signify that they're willing to listen to genuine concerns from members across the House. And there are some UK-wide issues that this government could and should legislate on. My colleague, the Honourable Member for Central Ayrshire, has led the campaign calling for default separate payments and universal credit to protect the victims of domestic abuse from financial coercion. And we on these benches were dismayed that that was dismissed out of hand by the Department of Work and Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. So will the Minister speak to her counterparts at the DWP to urgently introduce default separate payments, or at least create provision for the Scottish Government to do that, because of course that is one of the many aspects of welfare powers which are not yet devolved. There's also, as has been mentioned by others, the insecure immigration status of women who are victims of domestic violence. And I want to know what the Minister is doing to extend the eligibility of the destitute domestic violence concession so that it supports more migrant women, and more generally what discussions she will have with her counterparts to support migrant women who are the victims of domestic abuse throughout the United Kingdom.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable and Learned member for her astute and concise analysis of the legal position. And may I also put on record our thanks, the UK Government's thanks, to the Scottish Government for the work they do with us on this and other associated crimes, such as, for example, stalking and harassment. She's absolutely right. This is we are being, I hope the House realises, we are being very much open and transparent about the process of this bill. It is a draft bill, specifically so that there can be a joint committee, which is an unusual level of scrutiny, I think it's fair to say, for the House, a joint committee of both Houses to look at the detail of this bill and to see whether there are improvements that can be made. On the specific issue of universal credit, I know very much the issues that have been raised on these benches. There are already a range of special provisions for victims of domestic abuse, for example, temporary accommodation, easements, same-day advances and signposting to expert support. But I do welcome the recent measures introduced by my Right Honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, regarding payments to the primary carer. We will continue to work on this together. But I do make this observation. We all know, those of us who take a particular interest in this subject, that, of course, economic abuse, all forms of domestic abuse, has no regard to income levels, job status or whatever. So we must make sure that our answers are right, not just for those on low incomes, but also women who perhaps don't need recourse to the welfare system.
Maria Caulfield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I echo the words of actually the Shadow Minister to agree that there is a democratic deficit in Northern Ireland at the moment, and in Northern Ireland questions this morning, that we heard that there is no mental capacity legislation currently in Northern Ireland. On our select committee, we've heard that they're still working to statements rather than EHCP plans. The suicide strategy is sitting there but cannot be implemented. We've got the issue of equal marriage. This is much bigger than this bill, and just to change this bill to deal with one issue actually undervalues the role of devolution. The priority must be about getting the Assembly functioning back in Northern Ireland and dealing with all the inequality issues which are so important to the people in all communities.
Very much. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for setting out the political complexities of this, but also the impacts for people living in Northern Ireland. And again, I'm not sure we can solve the issue of devolved politics in Northern Ireland on the floor of this urgent question, but we have very much contacted the Northern Irish, the Permanent Secretary who is currently acting in a temporary capacity in relation to Northern Ireland, because we do want to see what can be done to help women in Northern Ireland as well as in England and Wales.
Diana Johnson.
Speaker, I have a great deal of time for the Minister, but I wonder what she really thinks about how long it is acceptable to use the problem of the being no assembly in Northern Ireland for this House not to act on the breach of women's human rights in Northern Ireland, which we have debated at length in this chamber. And I'd be interested to know what the Minister has to say about that.
Well, I'm extremely grateful to the honourable member who I note her campaign on the particular issue of abortion and decriminalisation of the law regarding abortion. I'm not at the risk of overreaching myself. I'm not sure it's my place at this dispatch box at this place and time to give an assessment of how long it is taking, other than to say that, as with the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary, everyone in this government, we are very, very keen and urge all those parties present in Northern Ireland to please get back round the table. There are so many issues that need their attention.
Helen Whately.
Mr. Speaker, can I ask my honourable friend to confirm two things? Firstly, that she is committed and determined to tackling domestic abuse in all its forms, and secondly, that she's determined to improve the rights and protections for women across the United Kingdom.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. Yes, what I hope, as this bill makes its passage through pre-legislative scrutiny, but also through this House and the other place, I hope what will happen is that people who perhaps aren't as passionate about tackling domestic abuse, or it hasn't become a priority for them yet, I very much hope that the message will get out to people that domestic abuse isn't restricted to acts of violence. It can encompass sexual abuse, it can encompass coercive controlling behaviour, it can encompass economic abuse. And more interestingly, since we launched the draft bill last week, I have been inundated with emails from victims of all different forms of domestic abuse, seeking help, saying thank you for recognising the hell they are going through. And that in itself, if every member can help us inform and educate people as to the forms of domestic abuse, that in itself will be incredibly powerful in terms of helping victims.
Jim Shannon.
Speaker,
My party, the Democratic Unionist Party, recognises the importance of tackling domestic abuse and supporting victims of domestic violence. However, there is a devolved issue in Northern Ireland, and the need to strengthen legislation should be dealt with by the Northern Ireland Assembly. If the honourable member wants to amend the bill to change the law on abortion in Northern Ireland, then this would breach the devolution settlement. The emphasis should be, must be, has to be to restore devolved government in Northern Ireland. The government and all members of this House, both sides of the chamber, should respect the right of the people of Northern Ireland to deal with these matters through their elected assembly.
Well, as the honourable gentleman, of course, speaks for his constituency, and I'm pleased to hear that he is urging others in Northern Ireland to get back round the table and help to deal with these many issues. But as already been pointed out, this is but one important issue facing Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom as a whole.
Vicky Ford.
Very much. Can I thank the Minister for this bill, which I do believe will transform the way we deal with this horrific crime, which largely impacts on women, although men, of course, can be impacted by domestic violence as well. I think it's totally despicable that politicians in Northern Ireland have left such a void in this and other areas now for 2 years. But can the Minister confirm that the devolved powers, which mean that this bill has to be only England and Wales, have actually been devolved for many decades?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and she's absolutely right, actually. I'm particularly grateful to her for pointing out that although the vast majority of victims are female, indeed of the 2 million people affected, it is estimated that 1.3 million are female. Nonetheless, men can, of course, be victims of domestic abuse as well, and that's why, through the non-legislative package of measures which sits alongside the bill, we are also investing in, for example, a specific helpline for male victims, because we understand that they face particular stigmas in terms of being a male victim. They may feel even greater pressure not to seek help. But on the point about the nature of the laws, the criminal laws underpinning the prosecution of domestic abuse offences, she's absolutely right. I mean, the Section 18 of the Offences Against the Persons Act dates back to 1861.
Was part of the UK.
Jess Phillips.
I would just like to point out that in 1861 there was no devolution. The whole of Ireland was part of the UK, so things have somewhat moved on since 1861. Anyway, that wasn't my question, Mr. Speaker. I've just had the indulgence. I'm going to ask about domestic abuse, and I'm going to ask specifically why the bill, currently, in its current form, and I accept that that may well change, and I certainly will be seeking to change it, does not have any statutory or immigration law changes in it to protect migrant women. I know throughout the consultation that there was a very strong push about how this bill will not help any women unless it helps all the women. We have to leave no woman behind, and currently migrant women have been left behind by this bill. And if we extend it to have immigration law in it, of course the extent of the bill will be expanded, and I asked the Minister, would she welcome that?
Well, I'm extremely grateful to the Honourable Lady, who needs no introduction in terms of her experience and expertise in this area. In terms of expanding the bill to alter the immigration status, the view was taken that although domestic abuse does affect, of course it does, women who are not British citizens or do not have the right to remain, that is, the bill as a whole must focus on victims and the types of abuse and how we treat abuse. I'm very much welcoming her wish to assist Sorry, I'm trying to keep a straight face because the honourable lady in front of her is gesticulating wildly from a sedentary position. The honourable lady knows that I will welcome her contributions during the scrutiny process. Indeed, I hope she'll be involved in it. I do note, of course, that there are various provisions in place to help women who, for example, have come across on a spousal visa, but both the Immigration Minister and I are very alert to those the challenges that those women face and are very keen to work with her.
Rebecca Powell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I must agree, Mr. Speaker, that Northern Ireland must get their political system up and running to tackle these really serious issues. But I really wanted to welcome this draft bill, such an important step in tackling domestic abuse, particularly areas not previously tackled, for example, controlling behaviour of the elderly. And I wondered if the Minister could just put this whole thing in perspective so that we can really understand how important the bill is. How many people does she think will be helped by this bill in all of its forms?
Well, thank you to the honourable friend. She's absolutely right, actually, to draw attention to elder abuse. The number of colleagues and indeed people who have contacted me since the launch of the draft bill to tell me their stories of abuse from their children or grandchildren are just heartbreaking, actually. And indeed, the honourable member, his Labour Member of Parliament, I forget his constituency, but I'm sure Hansard will help me in due course, several months ago called a very important Westminster Hall debate on abuse by children on their parents and grandparents. And so this is something we are keen to uncover and to shine a light on, because if you are a parent and you are being abused by your child, again, the stigma, the shame that victims so unfortunately and I think wrongly feel is compounded even more because people parents feel that they should be able to control the behaviour of their children and so on. So we want to shine a light on this and say to everyone, whether they're parents, children, grandchildren, the abuse in your home is not right, and we are here to help.
Liz Kendall.
The Minister failed to answer the central question raised by my honourable friend, the member for Walthamstow. Who decided to exclude Northern Ireland from this bill, and was it discussed with the DUP?
Hear, hear.
So the process, as the honourable lady knows, any bill that is put forward has to go through various committees of government to ensure that cross-government, given we have collective responsibility, that it meets with the approval. I do not know any meetings she has talked about with the DUP. I will happily take that away, but as far as I was concerned, I looked at the bill, I've examined it very, very carefully, and it seems to me the central point about devolved matters, I'm afraid, applies, and I know it doesn't meet with the approval of the honourable member, but the fact is that the law is the law, and we are having to build a bill around it. We have, as I say, I have written to the devolved Assembly in Scotland and to the Permanent Secretary in Northern Ireland, and those communications are ongoing.
Hugh Merriman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Look, the Supreme Court judgment made it absolutely clear that lawmakers would have to change the law to give greater rights to women from Northern Ireland in the circumstances that was discussed. And so I would ask the Minister, if it's not this law that will be able to bring those rights in, for women who my colleagues and I met, women like Sarah Hewitt, who shouldn't have to go all the way through a court process to get their rights, it adds insult to injury for them. So I would ask the Minister, who always listens, if not this law, which law will be brought in by this Parliament that's responsible for treaty compliance, not Northern Ireland, to give these rights to the women who deserve them?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I know he works on a wide range of issues tackling violence against women and girls. I return to the point that, well, first of all, the case he refers to, and I don't want to be legalistic about this, but he's asked me specifically, if he recalls, the Supreme Court judgment was not able to deliver a full ruling on that because the litigant bringing the proceedings was not judged to have locus. I have to say that because that's the situation. I obviously can't comment, mustn't comment on the specific case that has been referred to in the Chamber that is going through the court process at the moment. But I return to the point that this is a bill about domestic abuse, and we have to focus on the subject matter of the title of the bill, and any matters in relation to devolved powers is part of a much, much wider debate across government.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I welcome, as I'm sure others do, the Minister's obvious passion and commitment to tackling domestic abuse, which for all of us here I think is the central issue. As someone who believes passionately as well in devolution, I would like to ask, though, devolution means to transfer or to delegate power to another body. That body at the moment does not exist. Devolution does not mean to abrogate responsibility. Those women are citizens of the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom government has a responsibility, surely, to respect the views expressed by our own Supreme Court and the United Nations that the human rights of women in Northern Ireland are not being protected. Does the Minister not agree with me that that should be the overriding principle in this, not whether or not the devolution, which is not working at the moment, should be preserved?
The Honourable Lady, and I thank her for her kind comments, the Honourable Lady has perhaps recognised the situation we find ourselves in that these matters have been devolved, and as I say, I go back to the point that the criminal laws that underpin the prosecution of domestic abuse, etc., they are devolved, and so. And it doesn't, as we've heard, doesn't just have an impact in relation to domestic abuse. There's a whole wide range of measures that are affected by the issue of the Assembly not being able to be convened yet in Northern Ireland. And I'm sorry it won't meet with her approval, but the only answer I can give is to yet again urge those who can make a difference in Northern Ireland to please get back round the table and start talking to each other.
Daniel Rowley.
While I would welcome the inclusion of financial abuse as a type of domestic abuse in the bill, it simply is not enough to have that as words when government policy is trapping women in financially abusive relationships. Universal credit payments must be automatically split. Charities have said that this is giving a hand to abusers by not having automatically split payments. So because the honourable member on the SNP front bench didn't quite get a straight answer, I ask, will the Minister not recognise this and meet with her colleagues in the DWP to urge that universal credit payments must be split?
If I may, just to correct the honourable member, we're not talking about financial abuse, we talk about economic abuse, because we appreciate that abuse can take many forms. For example, preventing access to food cupboards in the kitchen, taking her mobile phone away so that she has, it's restricted who she can contact, even hiding the car keys so that she can't get to work in the morning on time, which then puts her employment at risk, and with all the ramifications that can have. As to the point about universal credit, I am in constant dialogue with my colleagues in the Department for Work and Pensions. As I say, the fact that the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, who was formerly of the Home Office manner, is now in that department, and the fact that one of the first announcements she has made is this important announcement in terms of looking after primary carers, I very much hope gives reassurance and comfort to the House that we are looking at this very, very carefully.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
Criminal justice is not yet devolved to Wales, but I would draw attention to and commend the Violence Against Women, Domestic Abuse and Sexual Violence Act, which came into force in Wales in 2015. Now, its 2018 progress report raises concern about a lack of collaboration and integration between the devolved and non-devolved organisations charged with taking forward the aims of the Act. What discussions, I'd like to ask, has she had with the Minister responsible in Welsh Government to address this?
Well, I'm very concerned to hear that, not least because I visited Cardiff myself a few months ago as part of our domestic abuse consultation engagement events to listen to people who are doing great work in Wales to tackle domestic abuse and to see how we can improve that collaboration. But I've very much taken on board what she said about that, and if that is something we need to improve upon, she knows, I hope, that I will not rest until that has happened.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker, and I welcome the Minister's response today. And I also welcome the support from the SNP, and in particular the Honourable and learned member for Edinburgh South West with regards to the women in Northern Ireland. The Minister has said that the criminal elements of this, of course, are devolved, but the Supreme Court's warning from last year is that the human rights are not devolved, but they're indeed extended. Is this not a missed opportunity to empower the Minister and the Secretary of State at the Home Office with regard to the human rights matter of victims of domestic violence and of women in general?
Again, I absolutely understand the feeling and the reasons for the Honourable Gentleman raising this. I have to, again, at the risk of being legalistic, the Supreme Court judgment, that was, if you like, an advisory judgment because of the locus. I cannot, I hope he appreciates, talk about the case that is going through the court process at the moment. I'm sure when that judgment is delivered, of course, we will be looking at it very carefully. But I come back to the point that at the moment, on this and a whole range of issues, domestic abuse is devolved. And I just remind the House gently that the topic of the bill is domestic abuse. And not every abortion is as a result of domestic abuse. That is the, just by way of explanation.
Alison Thewlis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd just like to start by saying to the Minister that unless she's going to devolve DWP and UKVI functions, it would be a missed opportunity for this bill not to tackle those issues that those departments are responsible for, particularly with regards to women in the immigration system, and particularly regards with some DWP policies, including the rape clause, which, in the way that it is formed, either forces a woman to leave an abusive relationship at a time not of her choosing, which can be extremely dangerous, or denies her support. I would also be interested to know a bit more about the recommendations for training for DWP staff, because I have heard from some organisations that this can be sorely lacking in the advice that is offered to women. And again, this is something that would be for England and for Scotland as well, and I would like to know how that exactly would operate. And lastly, if the Speaker will allow, it was announced today that judges and sheriffs in Scotland will be given specific domestic violence training, particularly around this coercive control, to all of them, and will she consider doing something similar for all judges in the English court system too?
Provided a comprehensive coverage of her concerns, to which doubtless there will be an equally comprehensive response from the Minister on the Treasury bench.
I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker. So, first of all, may I thank her for pointing to the fact that this draft bill, important though it is not the only action that the government is taking in relation to tackling domestic abuse. Indeed, there are some 120 commitments that sit alongside the bill. Training, given it's the, she mentioned it latterly, that is a crucial part of our package, not just of DWP or job centre workers, but across what I would call the front lines. So, for example, housing association officers, but of course police officers as well, and the judiciary. The judiciary in England and Wales already receive training on this, but we very much keep it under review. And we are, I should say, also looking at the offence itself, of course, of coercive controlling behaviour, because although it's been enforced for 3 years now, we appreciate it can be a very difficult offence to both investigate and then prosecute. So we're reviewing that to ensure it is as effective as possible. And in relation to the Department for Work and Pensions more generally, of course, I'm in conversation with, as I say, my counterparts in the Department for Work and Pension. We very much want to have this as a wraparound approach, which is why the announcement by the Secretary of State, I think, was so significant.
Alex Norris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like lots of members across this place, we're very enthusiastic about this bill and the potential for really making a difference in our communities, which is why it's really disappointing that here now at the first, well, not even at the first hurdle, we're already divided on the matter. I've worked with the Minister on a number of issues very constructively, so it gives me no pleasure to ask this, but I feel that I must. When the decision was made to not put things in this bill, such as migration, such as welfare, and therefore allowing the government to restrict its territorial scope for just England and Wales, was that a decision based on the best interests of women in the United Kingdom, or was that a narrow political judgment?
I'm extremely grateful to the honourable gentleman. Indeed, I find myself being held to account by him in pretty much all of my portfolio. In relation to the territory of the bill, I do draw honourable members' attention back to the consultation which was launched last year. At that point, the consultation was in scope for England and Wales. So I wouldn't want honourable members to leave this chamber thinking there's been some handbrake turn, if you like, in relation to the territorial decisions made for this bill. The fact is that this is a devolved matter. It is why I'm speaking or have written to the devolved assembly in Scotland, the government in Scotland, and also our Northern Irish counterparts to see if we can reach agreement as to whether or not they want to implement these measures as well. And I hope he understands that all along my motivation for this is to help the victims of domestic abuse, not just today, not just of those victims who, when I was prosecuting in the criminal courts 15 years ago, I couldn't help them because none of these measures were anywhere near coming, but also victims in the future, because we all know the impact that domestic abuse can have on children growing up in abusive households. We need to break that cycle of violence.
Ian Paisley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier, a right honourable member said that there was no devolved institutions in Ireland in 1861. Of course, in 1840, under Daniel O'Connell, the first Home Rule movement commenced, and by 1861, the second movement was well underway, leading to devolution and the creation of 2 parliaments in Ireland. I think it's important to have that on the record. It is unfortunate that some members have tried to conflate a domestic abuse bill, a very important domestic abuse bill that we will support here in England and Wales, with what is happening with a very confusing situation in Northern Ireland, and it is unfortunate that that has been conflated. Does the Minister agree that the confusion of that means that we have this strange arrangement that at one moment in this Parliament some members talk about protecting absolutely the integrity of the Belfast Agreement when it comes to some matters that we discuss, namely Europe, but then when we move to domestic arrangements that are specifically devolved under the terms of the Belfast Agreement, we can suddenly cast those arrangements totally aside. That confusion has got to go. We either accept devolution, we accept it, we implement it, or we do what the Labour front bench seems to be saying, and that is introduce direct rule.
Well, may I thank the honourable gentleman for his history lesson on Ireland and Northern Ireland. I mean, again, he makes the point eloquently that with devolved matters we can't pick and choose, and it is the mention of the Good Friday Agreement, I hope, just reminds us all, if we need reminding, as to the particular sensitivities in Northern Ireland, how we've reached where we are today in its broad history, but of course very much hoping that those who can get round the table do so that we can sort these matters and other matters out.
Andy Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Was this bill vetted by the Cabinet Office in relation to the Confidence and Supply Agreement?
I do not understand what the gentleman is trying to get to. I've already said that this bill, like every piece of legislation, has to go through what's called right round. It's where every government department, which includes the Cabinet Office, considers the bill. And I'm very conscious of the responsibility that I have as the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State at the Home Office, but also, of course, the fact that we share this bill with the Ministry of Justice. This is the way in which the bill has been developed, created. The consultation, as I say, last year was clear in its scope, and we're bringing this bill forward in good faith.
Thank you. Point of order, Jess Phillips.
I apologise, Mr Speaker, for not giving you advance notice of this. It just came to me. If this matter is for England and Wales, can I just clarify, can I clarify to the Speaker that if that is the case, that this bill is just for England and Wales, that the rules of evil will be in place in regard to this bill, and of course members from Scotland and Northern Ireland will not be invited to vote on anything to do with the domestic abuse bill.
I think it would be somewhat premature of me from the Chair to offer a judgment on that matter at this time, certainly when legislation that is potentially open to such designation, it is the normal practice that I am advised on it, that I see the paperwork relating to it, and that a view is formed. So that is something of a holding response, but the matter is clearly going to be live. It is, of course, a draft bill to be considered, I think, by a committee, and it seems to me unimaginable that this point will not be further explored, both during consideration by the committee and subsequently. And I think that the Honourable Lady is herself a living testimony to the truth of what I have just said. It is unimaginable that it will not be the subject of further discussion, questioning, and therefore a requirement for ministerial response. And obviously, I should just say, as much for the benefit of people attending our proceedings as for members in the Chamber, the very fact that I granted an urgent question on it, I think it's the 550th urgent question, is testament to the fact that I regarded it as a matter that warranted the attention of the House and the response of a minister in the Chamber today. A point of order, Mr Gregory Campbell.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. I notified you earlier about the point of order I seek to make. As I did the honourable member, I wish to mention the member for Dulwich and West Norwood. Yesterday, in Treasury questions, the honourable member for Dulwich and West Norwood had indicated that she had received correspondence from a constituent, which is fine, we all respond to constituents, but the quote that was used in Hansard, in the Chamber here in Treasury questions, was that in relation to a bomb that went off in Londonderry 2 weeks ago, the official position is that the recent bomb attack is nothing to do with Brexit. Everyone I've spoken to finds this laughable. It is everything to do with Brexit. Unquote, Mr Speaker. The police immediately after that bomb, Mr Speaker, made it clear who was responsible, the dissident Republican movement in Northern Ireland. Those who planted the device have issued a statement which I won't read out in totality, but the comment about it, the reference to it was, all this talk of Brexit, hard borders, soft borders, has no bearing on our actions and the IRA won't be going anywhere, etc., etc., unquote. Mr Speaker, I ask your guidance in terms of the need for all of us to speak responsibly, to deal effectively with issues that come to us, but to do so in a way that does not raise the spectre of added incentives to those who activate violence or would support or give credence to violence in any way.
Well, I'm most grateful to the honourable gentleman for his courtesy in giving me advance notice of his intention to raise his point of order, and I am obliged to him also for confirming in the Chamber that he has notified the Honourable Lady, the member for Dulwich and West Norwood, of his intention to raise the matter. It is, of course, the responsibility of each and every honourable member to have a care for the accuracy and appropriateness of what is said in this chamber. It has to be added that in saying what they think is accurate and appropriate, very often other honourable and right honourable members disagree with their assessment. And the reason why I say that, as people will readily appreciate, is that that is the nature of political discourse. If anybody else wishes to contribute on this matter, of course I'll happily hear the Honourable Lady. She's not under any obligation, but if she wishes to do so. So I hope that the Honourable Gentleman will feel that he has registered his point with his usual force and courtesy, and it is on the record. Point of order, Helen Hayes.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I also thank the honourable member for advance notice of his point of order. I hope the honourable member will respect that yesterday I quoted verbatim from a constituent of mine who works and is an employer in the honourable member's constituency in Northern Ireland and has spent extensive time there for over several years. The question was not conjecture, but a report of reality on the ground. Responsibility for individual despicable acts of violence clearly rests squarely with the perpetrator. But after 30 years of the Troubles, peace in Northern Ireland was painstakingly negotiated through the Good Friday Agreement. The constituent has been raising concerns with me for several months over escalating tensions in the community in Londonderry where his business is based. These issues and the impact that Brexit is already having on a fragile and complex situation in Northern Ireland have been reported widely, but there has been very little discussion of them in this chamber. Yet they are of an order of magnitude which demands that they are raised. If the DUP will not raise them, where I have cause to via my constituents, I will do so. The Prime Minister has so far failed to give any details of alternative arrangements for the Irish border to provide reassurance that a frictionless border without infrastructure is possible.
Order. No, I have indulged the honourable. I have indulged the honourable lady who always addresses the House with great courtesy, but I hope she'll forgive me. She's very forensic, but she was reading out what amounted to a speech on this matter, and therefore it strains credulity to suppose that it could be characterised as a point of order. She has made her point. I have no wish normally to cut her off, but she has made her point with considerable force and insistence, and she enjoys the benefit of the endorsement of her right honourable friend, the member for Exeter, who has just observed from a sedentary position that she's made her point very well. So I suspect that her cup runneth over, and I think that she should leave it there. I think she should leave it there. Oh, very well. Point of order, Minister Ben Wallace.
I rise really to make the point of order in support of your comment that political discourse does, of course, produce different points of view. But I would ask that, as a point of order, people recognise in this House that speculating on live actions of intelligence and investigations are unhelpful and rarely reflect the facts, and that all members should be cautious in this House about entering into either sub judice or live investigations with speculation that can in fact add fuel to the fire.
And everybody should be responsible in his or her use of language, and I can say only, however, that whilst I am not unmindful of the point that the Minister has made, no breach of order has taken place, and so we will leave it there. But the honourable gentleman has made his point with some force, and I don't wish to add to it and don't think there is any need for me to do so. But I've got a feeling that the right honourable gentleman, the member for Rayleigh, thinks that the House needs to hear him, and therefore will have a point of order from Mr Mark Francois.
Point of order. Very briefly, I apologise for not giving you notice, but it's actually very straightforward. I had a meeting earlier this month with Mr Andrew Haynes, the Chief Executive of Network Rail, to discuss the delay in completing engineering works on the Southern Victoria to Liverpool Street line, which is something which is vexing my constituents greatly. They briefed me on a new plan to shorten the works, which was welcome. I then went on to the media and explained what would happen in good faith. The following Monday, they contacted me and said, "I'm terribly sorry, we got that slightly wrong," and then changed what they had offered. I think this was a genuine mistake. Hang on. But they promised to write to me by the end of the month to clarify the matter. There are 2 days to go. No letter has been received. Would you agree if they give a guarantee like that, it would be a good idea to keep it? It
would be a very good idea to keep it as a matter of principle. Moreover, as the right honourable gentleman has aired the issue in the chamber, that seems to me to constitute an additional reason why it would be politic or prudent for that letter of response to be provided. The right honourable gentleman will probably recall that the late Sir Gerald Kaufman was much given to tabling questions about when he would receive a reply to a letter that he'd sent or a question that he'd posed. And Sir Gerald was wont to observe that shortly after he had tabled the said question, the reply to a letter or question from some considerable period earlier seemed then miraculously and speedily to arrive. And what I could say to that Chief Executive, if he were here, he isn't, so I can't, but I'll say it indirectly, is that I remember what a persistent fellow the Right Honourable Gentleman was in 1986 when he stood against me in a student election. He was a very dedicated campaigner. He was unsuccessful on that occasion, but he was a very dedicated campaigner. And I think it would be altogether wiser for the Chief Executive just to recognise that of one thing he can be certain: the Right Honourable Gentleman won't go away. He will just become more and more and more demanding. So that letter should arrive sooner rather than later. Thank you. If there are no further points of order, we come now, perhaps somewhat belatedly, to the 10-minute rule motion for which the Honourable Lady, the Member for Totnes, has been so patiently waiting. 10-minute rule motion, Dr. Sarah Wollaston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to establish requirements in connection to the United Kingdom's withdrawal from the European Union. Mr. Speaker, we do not have the luxury of time, because unless an alternative is in place, in 58 days from now, we will leave the European Union with no deal in place at all, and that is just 29 sitting days. My bill looks ahead to what happens next if, as looks likely, the Prime Minister returns empty-handed from her mission impossible to Brussels. And this bill is based on the recommendations of the 11th report for this session of the House of Commons exiting the European Union Committee. And so I'd like to start by paying tribute to the Chair, the Right Honourable Member for Leeds Central, and to all the members of his committee for their excellent report. The Prime Minister has repeatedly commented that whilst this House has said what it does not want, it needs to decide what it does. And in the event of no agreement to change the backstop, we're back to square one with one very important difference, and that is that we are much nearer the edge of the cliff to no deal. In a nutshell, this bill would allow the House to express its view on what could command the support of the House through a series of indicative votes on freestanding motions, and the committee recommended that they should be taken in order. So just to set that out briefly, first giving the House an opportunity to vote on the Prime Minister's negotiated withdrawal agreement and framework for the future relationship. Second, the option of leaving with no deal. Third, a further opportunity to instruct the government to seek changes to the backstop, although I think by then we would have tested that to destruction. Fourth, instructing the government to seek a Canada-style deal as set out in the report. Fifth, seeking to join the EEA through the EFTA pillar and rejoining a customs union with the European Union, or a variation of this, or I should say remaining in a customs union or a variation of this. And finally, it would seek approval for a public vote to return the decision to the British people, to give them the opportunity to decide which kind of Brexit deal they want, or whether they wish to remain in the European Union on the deal that we already have. Now, last night, this House gave two instructions to the government. Not for the first time, it rejected leaving the European Union with no deal. But it also passed an amendment unilaterally requiring that the Northern Ireland backstop be replaced by unspecified alternative arrangements to avoid a hard border. It adds up, essentially, to tearing up the withdrawal agreement. And Donald Tusk, in his statement following the vote, has made clear that the backstop is part of the withdrawal agreement, and the withdrawal agreement is not open for renegotiation. And I think that most people do not seriously feel that the European Union will be prepared to do so. But the point here is that in the absence of meaningful changes to the withdrawal agreement, it's hard to see how the government is going to command support for a deal that was rejected so comprehensively by a margin of 230 votes. This House would then have the opportunity to express its view where the Prime Minister should go from here if this bill went ahead. by giving an opportunity not only for the House to reject no deal, but, as I say, to look at other alternatives. But just to be clear why the House has rejected no deal. No government could seriously, knowingly and deliberately inflict this kind of pain on its people. We're talking not just changes to the economy, but to livelihoods and jobs. The real world crashing into Brexit fantasy, I'm afraid. And not just for our economy, but also across so many different sectors, across health, across transport links, across our security, across food and farming. The list is very long. And as I say, I do not feel that any responsible government could inflict that kind of pain. But unfortunately, up until now, the Prime Minister has given this House a binary choice: my deal or no deal. This bill would allow the House to say there are other routes forward. I know that there are colleagues that still want to press forward with the idea of EEA, EFTA and a customs union, and others that would prefer a Canada-style arrangement. And I think that all of us should have the opportunity to say which way forward. I and many of my colleagues have made clear that we would favour returning this decision to the British people, to give them the final say. Because the problem with the original referendum was that it did not set out which of these many options the public were voting for. Once we know what that decision is, we will know that it is far removed from the sunlit uplands that were promised during the referendum campaign. And I would say that we need to seek the informed, valid consent of the British people, because otherwise we are pressing forward with a deal that commands neither the respect of the Leavers nor the Remainers. Nobody could realistically claim that it is the will of the people. But by taking it back to the people, allowing them to see exactly what is involved, to weigh up the risks and benefits, that would mean that we had informed, valid consent, and we could proceed together. And it is quite possible that the British people would decide they still wanted to proceed with Brexit. I accept that. And they would need to have the absolute guarantee that that would then be acted on as quickly as possible. But it would also allow them to change their minds. And my feeling is that everybody deserves the opportunity to change their minds. Even our first DEXU secretary famously commented that if people cannot change their minds in a democracy, then it ceases to be a democracy. And so I would reject the notion that is sometimes put forward that it is somehow a betrayal of democracy to ask people again. I particularly object to the assertion that it would somehow cause civil unrest. We need to stop talking that situation up. Since when did this House bow in, cave in to the concerns and the demands of the far right? We should be standing up to that and making it absolutely clear that democracy does not stand still. It should never stand still. And that we have an absolute duty in this House to give the public the right to vote, to have their final say, to recognise that this call doesn't come from the European Union. It comes from the people, to the hundreds of thousands of people who marched through the streets of London in the summer, and for the many hundreds of thousands beyond that who didn't make it here but write to us and campaign for the right to vote, to have the final say, for a people's vote. We owe it to them in this House to debate that and to have a vote on it as part of a series of indicative votes. So I commend this bill to the House.
Thank you. Order. The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. Mr Charlie Elphick.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to oppose this bill. Like my honourable friend, for whom I have the deepest respect, I supported Remain in the referendum. And in my constituency in Dover, as with my honourable friend's constituency, a majority voted to leave. And so it seemed to me that as a Democrat, and having voted to have a referendum in 2016, and that referendum having taken place with 17.5 million people having voted to leave the European Union, a majority, that we must respect the referendum. And so from that day I made very clear that I would do everything I could to ensure that the people's vote was respected, that we made sure that we executed the instructions that we had been given. And we need to be very clear. The people of this country didn't vote for Remain, they voted for Leave. And that's why we must take no Brexit off the table. And to have the idea of a second referendum that would be the Prime Minister's deal or Remain would load that question in a way which is entirely wrong and entirely unacceptable. I think it would be a travesty of our democracy. And I'd just like to say to the House why it was I originally backed Remain. I backed Remain because I thought that a big project like Brexit would be very difficult for Britain. If we couldn't manage a basic patient record system in the NHS, what hope did we have with a really huge project like Brexit? And I was also concerned that members of this House would also think that their constituents might be very clever to elect them, but not so able to decide a big decision like leaving the European Union, that they might not accept that decision and they might fight it all the way. I worried that our civil society wasn't strong enough. I worried that our machinery of government would blow a fuse in trying to manage a project of this sort. And in that, I have not been disappointed. But the vote having taken place, I thought that we had to respect the referendum. So I put my shoulder to the wheel on how we can make ready at day one, deal or no deal, how we can make sure that it's a success, how we didn't have to hand over all this money that they wanted, how they had no legal right to demand it, to make the best negotiating case for our country. And the worst negotiating case for our country is to rule out no deal, because if the other side knows that you won't get up and walk away from the table, they know they've got you. And if they've got you, then they're going to give you a really rubbish deal. So the best way we get a good deal is by being prepared and ready on day one not to do a deal. Now, what have we seen? We've seen the people who don't want us to leave the European Union finance our campaign with foreign money, a campaign for a second referendum. Their spokesman from Davos telling us how we should lead our lives and how we shouldn't leave at all, and they want to have a loaded question. And then they try to frighten people. And I think the really wrong thing is the way they've tried to frighten people, telling people that we will die of thirst because our water will be poisoned, that we will die of starvation because no food will arrive, that our pets will die in quarantine, that our planes will never take off. This kind of irresponsible talk is what makes people so angry, because they say, actually, the establishment should be working to solve these problems and working to make sure that we're thoroughly ready, not trying to scare us, not trying to tell us how bad the economy will be, but actually make it work and make a success of it. And we've seen so often with these sort of Project Fear stories that they lose credibility. And in my constituency, my constituents shake their heads and say, this is not credible. No, I don't think Project Fear is right, and it's the wrong thing to do. It's irresponsible. But on the other hand, I don't subscribe to Project Pangloss, that it will all be a walk in the park. I think if we left without a deal, there would be bumps in the road. I think some of those bumps could be quite jarring, and we should be honest and open about that. But I don't think we should try and frighten people. I don't think we should try and tell people that they were stupid. I don't think we should try and tell people that they didn't know what they were doing. I don't think we should try and tell people that they didn't have informed consent. They were too stupid in 2016 to know which way to vote. I think people made up their minds about the European Union over many years, and they knew exactly what they were concerned about. And when they had the question put to them, they made the decision. And I suspect very strongly that if they were asked again, they'd make the same decision again. Because they would say, the establishment are not listening to us, we will tell them again. And they will. And worse than that, they would say, we will not only tell the establishment again, but to make a reverse decision, to turn our country round in 180 degrees, would make our country a laughingstock across the world. So that's why I think to have a second referendum would mean that by an even greater majority we'd vote to leave. But the real travesty of it is this, and I'll just finish with this. The real travesty with this would be this, that were we to go down the route of a second referendum, we'd just have endless Brexit, endless uncertainty, And the key message that people every day from my constituency give to me is, look, deal or no deal, let's just get on with it, put it in place and move on to the other things that concern us: jobs, money, schools, hospitals, and how we're going to build a better Britain for the future across the whole piece, and stop banging on about Brexit.
Order. The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think I wish the right honourable gentleman well in overcoming his indisposition. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Kenneth Clarke, Hilary Benn, Joanna Cherry, Mr. Dominic Grieve, Luciana Berger, Anna Soubry, Chuka Ramuna, Dr. Philip Lee, Heidi Allen, Mr. Ben Bradshaw, Gito Bebb, and myself, sir.
Dr. Sarah Wollaston.
European Union requirements relating to withdrawal bill.
Second reading what day?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Thank you. Order. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Crime Overseas Production Orders Bill Lords, as amended in the Public Bill Committee, to be considered.
Now.
Thank you. Order. We begin with Government New Clause 1, with which it will be convenient to consider all the amendments listed on the selection paper. To move New Clause 1, I call the Minister. Ben Wallace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And if I may just slightly apologise to the House, I noticed in the process of this bill, all the amendments have been put into a single grouping. So if members would forgive me, the speech to address the amendments is therefore in one single block. So I ask them to have patience. Madam Deputy Speaker, we come to the amendments 12, 1 and 24 that I would like to address at first. While I recognise 24, I think, has not been selected, I'm happy to obviously answer to the amendment as was tabled. Throughout this bill, like other bills I've taken through the House, Madam Deputy Speaker, I've always been keen to reach a consensus. The Labour front bench, as will the SNP, will know that I've been often open to their ideas, and in a number of the bills, such as the counter-terrorism bill, and indeed this bill, I have taken their ideas on board and put them into law. I do so because not only do I truly care about keeping our citizens safe, but I also know that our laws work best when they do what they set out to do, and they are supported by the broadest consensus of the public. This House, Madam Deputy Speaker, can't ignore the times we live in. In the last decade, we've become more and more dependent on the internet and smartphones. In fact, 78% of people and 95% of 16 to 24-year-olds now possess a smartphone. Such technology can be a source for good, but it also has become an accelerant to those who wish us harm. Whether it is county lines, terrorism or child abuse, smartphones have opened up a whole world of encrypted communications that I believe present the biggest single challenge to our police and law enforcement. There have been many days as Security Minister, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I will remember being woken for a number of security issues. Being woken on the night of Manchester Arena, or indeed the chilling news that nerve agent had been used on our streets of Salisbury. But the day, above all, that I remember in the last 2.5 years was a visit to a regional and organised crime unit, where I had to listen to a paedophile plot via an online chat room to kidnap, rape and kill a 7-year-old girl, about the same age as my daughter. If that wasn't sickening enough, I could sense the frustration of detectives who needed data from overseas to stop the abuse being committed. Because in case after case, timing is everything in these investigations. So when the US government, supported by senators in the House of Congress, offered to help solve this problem, we grabbed at the chance. the House should recognise what they have offered. They've offered to remove legal barriers in the US to enable compliance with UK court orders. The Americans recognised, as we do, that the vast majority of data that we need for our investigations reside on the other side of the Atlantic. Google, Facebook, YouTube, WhatsApp, to name but a few. In fact, 99% of data we need for child abuse investigations resides overseas, and only 1% resides here. These start figures say two things to me. Firstly, the reality is that we need the US data far, far more than they need ours. That was true before Donald Trump, and it will be true after Donald Trump. And secondly, in this case, the US is doing us a favour. The bill before us is the legislation required to give effect to a future US treaty. And any other treaty we may make with another country in the future, for example Canada, so we can access that data much quicker than we do now. These treaties will come before us separately to this House and their peers' House at a different time, and members will be able to scrutinise and challenge them at that point. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, let me deal directly with the amendments as tabled by the Labour Party. During the passage in the Lords, the Labour Party attached to this bill an amendment that would prevent the United Kingdom from making the necessary treaty with the US unless it got assurances that data sent across the Atlantic would not lead to the death penalty. This bill allows enforcement agencies to access content directly from communications service providers based overseas using an overseas production order. These orders can only work when a relevant international agreement, such as a treaty, is in place between the UK and another country. And as the majority of the CSPs, as I've said, are based in America, we expect the first such agreement to be with the United States. Both Amendments 1 and 12 attempt to amend the bill and reinsert the Lord amendments. Firstly, and bearing in mind how little data we hold here, having looked back over 20 years, we have not been able to find a single case whatsoever where only the data that the bill deals with would have led to a death penalty overseas. Secondly, this is about data, not people. Extradition from the UK is dealt with by separate legislation, and Her Majesty's government is already prevented from handing over someone without death penalty assurances. And thirdly, this bill is about our data requests overseas in order to bring data back here for investigations. And when I last looked, we don't have the death penalty in this country. So to try and use this bill as a vehicle to deal with a treaty as yet not concluded is simply wrong. Throughout the passage of the bill, I've been clear that the US has been generous in their offer. And I've also admitted on the record that this subject that we don't have equality of arms with the United States. This is not about a fancy that we are somehow bowing to the US. I noticed that the allegations the Right Honourable Member for Hackney made in her column recently in the Daily Mirror, saying that it was all about, and I quote, cozying up to Donald Trump. And the Labour Party's other amendment, that their amendment simply blocks data sharing cooperation with all countries if the death penalty is at risk. And that the reason ministers seem to be keen to tear up our laws and ignore human rights is because they are in a terrible mess in refusing to rule out a no-deal Brexit. Of course, nowhere in the Right Honourable Lady's op-ed does it address the central allegation that her blocking data will mean child abusers will be free to continue abuse of children for longer, because we simply won't be able to get the data, I'll let the Honourable Member in a minute, that we wish. And perhaps I could put her mind at rest. The US offer on this treaty wasn't initiated under President Donald Trump, but under President Obama. This is about the reality and the decisions we need to make to put our citizens' safety first. Members should understand that the current drawn-out methods of getting data can take months and years.
Thank you. I say the Security Minister knows very well that we've been working constructively on this bill, and I won't be opposing the bill at second reading, irrespective of the outcome of various votes. But it is correct to say that in the case in the summer, in respect the High Court has just issued its judgment, The American embassy told the government, when they failed incidentally to seek assurances at all, and I quote, that if they asked, at worst they will wind the President up to complain to the Prime Minister and potentially to hold a grudge. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office's strong advice was to seek a death penalty assurance. So why on earth didn't they, if it wasn't for fear of the American President's reaction?
Well, the honourable member makes an incredibly selective quote from the ruling in the High Court by the Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales that found in favour of the government on that case in all 5 counts. Every single count and every single challenge by Liberty and their glitterati up in the House of Lords failed at that test. And the honourable member has not also answered the very central charge, which is to jeopardise this legislation and the treaty puts at risk children because our law enforcement officers will not get the data timely. Is he happy to accept that that delay should be maintained for the sake of a theoretical, never-happened occasion in the future?
I am in favour of speeding up the data exchange. The position has been, under the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty since 1994, the seeking and securing of assurances has been commonplace. What I would say to the Minister is this: I'm afraid what I take from the High Court judgment, when ministers didn't even bother to ask for assurances in the summer, that I'm not confident they've been as robust as they should be in their negotiations with the United States. No point saying there isn't equality of arms in this treaty. What if he says that about a trade deal with the US? Are we going to be allowing then US companies to come and take our NHS? Stand up for this principle.
I'm going to stand up for security of our citizens. And a responsible government has to balance abstract, theoretical, minute probabilities with keeping our constituents safe. And maybe I should just remind the honourable member that in one of the cases we found, not related to this data, as I've said quite clearly, this bill produces not a single example in the last 20 years, but in the MLAT process in the past, where there has been no assurances sought, and indeed the government of the day indicated there was potentially a death penalty, it was his government that didn't seek the assurances and did transfer the data. And you know what that means? That means a responsible government knows the balance between keeping our citizens safe and making sure they comply with our international obligations. They have managed to do it on that side in the past, and I hope they do it again. But I have been clear, I have been absolutely clear, and you may say we would do a better job in the negotiations if we were in power. But as I pointed out, I will not give way, as I pointed out, you have plenty of time, I have plenty of time to give way. We don't have equality of arms. Our negotiating position, where there is 1% of data here versus 90-odd% of data there, means our leverage is minuscule when it comes to demanding strings attached to the United States. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
Thank you very much. Would the Minister agree that this should actually not be a point of political division in this House? It is the overwhelming priority of Parliament to protect children who are being raped, abused and exploited. And data sharing is very important. Part of the barriers to protecting children has been getting data to identify people who are doing this, because what we want to do is prevent the exploitation of children, and we need to do that. We need to identify those who would exploit them. And would you agree with me that this should be the issue, not the issue about views about Donald Trump or otherwise?
I totally agree with the Honourable Lady, and she would have heard the example I had to listen to. And that is a sobering, scary experience. Experience that our law enforcement officers hear every single day. And it is our duty to find a balance. I wish we had our own Google. I wish that all my constituents' data was held in the United Kingdom so we would have more control over it. But the fact is we live in the world we do, and that is the tragedy, and it makes us have to make deals that we might not always wish is perfect. But in this case, I am concerned, just like her, that what must come first is the children's needs, and terrorists and illicit finance and all the oligarchs that we worry about, that the front bench of the Labour Party also worries about how we are going to get them. And until we can crack that data net, this is something that is important. Yes, sir.
he's making a very important case for the provisions of the bill. I would agree we've got to get this data sharing and we should speed this up and get on with it. His new clause 1, which maybe he's about to talk to, looks like a pretty reasonable compromise that I'm assuming the government have tabled in this regard to provide the reassurances. It looks fairly complete to me. I can't see a reason why the House wouldn't just unanimously agree it.
Minister.
The right honourable member is right, and you know, right at the heart throughout the whole of this bill, and in further amendments, we will come to some concessions about journalistic protection, journalistic data that I have tabled and taken on board from members from all sides of the House. And throughout this bill, I have met many colleagues on your side of the House. I've met very helpful my shadow, who we have met on numerous occasions. We have offered concessions that have never been put before, and one of them is to put in primary legislation that we will mandate a Secretary of State to seek assurances. We cannot, in my view, go beyond that and force them to get the assurances, because a responsible government may not be in a position where they have the upper hand or have the leverage, but the security necessity is that important. So I have done that. That will be the first time in primary legislation we have done that. That will put in primary legislation a policy that existed in loose form under the Labour Party last government, where under exceptional circumstances ministers were allowed to not seek assurances or accept no assurances, and under the OSJA that was published by the coalition government in 2010, that the right honourable member was a member of the Cabinet, I think, at the time, when that was published, put in writing, Part 9, that there are lots of examples, there are occasions when you may be allowed to not seek a death penalty assurance. But I don't want that to become the dominant force, because, as I've said, in the last 20 years, we haven't found a single example that produces this challenge or quandary to a minister. This is simply about comms content data. It's about content data, and that is all this is about.
Giving way, and I hope he realises that on all sides of the House we want to find a way to share the data to go after these wicked people who abuse children, and I hope he will recognise that in his remarks. Can he therefore tell the House what efforts have been made in discussions with our American friends to find a treaty that deals with those crimes and other crimes, but stops short of those crimes that could result in a death penalty, carving those out, and so that we could come on a second treaty? What efforts have you made to do that?
Personally, I have myself asked them to look at carve-outs on that area, and I know officials are still in draft. This is my point. This treaty will come before the House. It is still even in draft stage. I haven't read the draft as it is. It is too early on. This is not going to appear next Tuesday as a treaty. It is going to be, a treaty that we will try and maintain as much of what we can in it, but recognising the leverage we have, recognising the generosity of the offer the Obama administration had originally made, and also recognising the need of our law enforcement agencies right now, as soon as possible, to get on with these investigations. And I just press on because I want to give an example. An operation commenced in August 2017 when there were indications that a UK male suspect was using Facebook, Instagram, Gmail and Snapchat for the purpose of committing child sexual offences. The male suspect's Facebook profile purports to be a teenage girl who requests friendship with teenage boys and then engages them in sexual communication, asking them to send indecent images and or videos of themselves committing sexual acts. The suspects sent indecent images of females sourced from the internet as bait to lure their victims into believing they were communicating with and sharing indecent images with a teenage girl. The investigation has identified 20 individual Facebook accounts where indecent images of children have been sent to the user of the suspect Facebook account. These individual accounts all belong to children. The value of data evidence is apparent because in this operation, the data has helped to identify in excess of 150 vulnerable child victims and enable law enforcement to safeguard the children. However, the law enforcement agencies are still awaiting the authorization from a US judge in a US court to release the content that would enable us to prosecute and put away that individual that is doing it. The consequence of that is that that individual is still at large. And while we have safeguarded the victims we know of, We are frustrated in being able to charge and prosecute that person. And we shouldn't forget that much data is held only for 12 months. And some of the MLAT cases go on till 2 years and months. So not taking up the US on this offer will mean that we will be shutting the door on our police being able to stop abuse more quickly or detecting terror plots before they reach fruition.
For the Minister giving way. Can I repeat that the case he's making is one that is supported on all sides of the House, and as I understand it, when we get to third reading, I very much doubt there will be division, and certainly from these benches will be supporting the bill on third reading. So he doesn't need to make that case because we all support him. The issue of this debate, his new Clause 1 and other alternatives, is whether or not we can achieve those goals which we all agree on, but also find a way to implement existing government policy about death penalty assurances. And I know he's worked because he's one of those ministers who does work across the House, and that is recognised, and that's why he's held in such high regard. But in this debate, we want to tease open, that is our right in this place, to scrutinise, Madam Deputy Speaker, to see whether or not, whether through the treaties or this bill, we can find a way to get those death penalty assurances that I'm sure he wants too.
I understand the right honourable gentleman, and I don't question his heartfelt desire to make sure we keep people safe. But actions have consequences. Now, he doesn't have to believe me when I say that the United States has indicated to me and to government that if we put strings attached in the way that has been placed by the amendment in the laws to this treaty that we are trying to put together, then the treaty will not progress. Now, he doesn't have to, excuse me, Madam Speaker, he doesn't have to believe me. He doesn't have to believe the United States. He can decide whether the United States will change their position or not. But I am saying to the House that my reading of it, having met with the United States and the Department of Justice and my officials and our embassy, and looked at the political situation that exists in the Senate, because I live in the real world, it's not how I necessarily vote, but that is the Senate, that I am living with that challenge, as any honourable member in this House would do, of balancing the reality. And my proposition to the House is, if this amendment goes through, then it will, including his, it will jeopardise that treaty, and I'm being very clear to him that if the treaty is jeopardised, the consequence is as I have set out. And no amount of "I wish it wasn't" will change that simple fact. Thank you, Madam.
I thank the Minister for giving way. Is it not the case that we're in danger of believing that there is a false choice here between upholding the UK's international obligations and taking action to secure this treaty? And in fact, what is the case is that the UK will be obliged to follow its treaty obligations, including those under the European Convention of Human Rights Protocol 12, without needing to follow one of the wrecking amendments which is being put down by the opposition parties and making the treaty that we all apparently want impossible to achieve.
Yes, I mean, ministers, and it's slightly in answer to the amendment as tabled, although not selected, ministers are obliged to act in accordance with our ECHR obligations. So we are obliged, throughout this process, that ministers have a legal duty under the Human Rights Act to act compatibly with convention rights, including Article 1 of the 13th Protocol, which was incorporated in Schedule 1 of the Human Rights Act 1998 and 2004. Were ministers to act unlawfully in making subordinate legislation under subsection 5b, which was incompatible with a convention right, it would be open to the courts to strike that legislation down, applying ordinary public law principles. And I'm happy to give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm most grateful to my honourable friend. Firstly, I want to confirm what he said. It's quite apparent that this treaty negotiated with the United States, and it's taken a long time to achieve. I remember being concerned and connected with it when I was Attorney General in raising the matter, and subsequently as Chairman of the Intelligence and Security Committee on visits to the United States. It's quite clear that this treaty is essential to prevent crime in this country, and it's equally clear that the strings which are sought to be attached to it would destroy it. I have no doubt about that at all, and I also endorse the point that's been made that the European Convention on Human Rights has to govern everything that we do, And my own view of this is that the sort of data that we are seeking to access and share for the purpose of fighting crime, the issue as to whether the death penalty might or might not result from an eventual criminal proceeding, which is speculative at that stage, is entirely irrelevant.
Well, my right honourable friend, who I've known for a long time, is the straightest politician in this House, if I may say, with always the best motive, but also a lawyer you would want at your side in government because he tells it as it is, not how you want it to be. So I thank him for his point. He knows how far back it goes, this effort. This is not a political charge, not an ideological step. It is, in fact, without this amendment, probably one of the most boring bills we've taken through the House, but important. It is not a playground to make ideological posturing about a theoretical issue. And I say to honourable members, there is a clear choice. Take up the offer from the United States, reject the amendment, and help keep our constituents safe. Or agree with the honourable member for Hackney, who believes even though there is no examples of this being the issue in the last 20 years, and where the likelihood of our tiny amount of data combines with a criminal investigation overseas, that then combines with a crime at stake being a capital offence, and that the offender is in a state that's either detained or in a United States state that has the death penalty, and where our data alone is the one crucial piece of evidence that will lead to conviction, we should say no to the US offer and put all of that at risk. If ever there was an example of politics getting in the way for the most bizarre and abstract reason, it is this. And I do have to make an apology. Come to the Honourable Gentleman. I'm afraid we have plenty of time because the grouping's all in one, so there will be plenty of amendments to go through. I do have to apologise to the Honourable Member for Hackney and the Leader of the Opposition. In her column, the Honourable Lady said that I attacked her personally by criticising what was going on. I apologise that I did so, but I did so because I'm afraid I mean it. Because that's not the Labour Party I know. I have family in the Labour Party. I have a relation that was a Labour MP in the 1930s, first Socialist Lord Advocate of Scotland, I think, if I remember. The Labour Party I know would not play that type of politics with our constituents. The Labour Party, led by pretty much nearly any other Member of Parliament on that side of the House, would never have indulged in this type of nonsense. The Labour Party I know in Lancashire, in the north of England, in Scotland, keeps people safe and recognises the responsibility that goes with governing. And that is a balance. It is a truly difficult balance that people of the best motives make every single day of upholding our values but keeping people safe. And that is why I'm afraid I apologise that I had to make it, but I made it in that way all the same, because it is incredibly important we understand that a government in waiting should be led by people that recognise that their duty in government will be to make those difficult decisions and reflect the reality of the 21st century we live in, and not some abstract theoretical nonsense that actually panders to a few. I'll give way to the honourable member.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way, and I really do regret the tone of some of that, because I think it is clear that on this bill we have worked together and the opposition are in favour of it. Let me just be clear what the difference is. The Honourable, the Minister, the Right Honourable Gentleman, essentially says that he's happy to be mandated to secure death penalty assurances. Ours simply sets out that in the event that they are sought but not obtained, the data should not be handed over. It affects, as he will say, a very, very tiny amount of cases. Nobody, however, is disputing the need to speed up the MLAP process to obtain the data. That's exactly what the difference is.
No, but the Labour front bench are saying that if they don't get what they want, they should block the treaty. We should not progress with the treaty. If the conditions from the United States or any other country is, look, I'm terribly sorry, but in the treaty we have 90% of the data and you have 1%, and here's our offer, and this is the reality of it, and if they don't give us the assurances we want, which, by the way, go beyond the OSJA, which go beyond the public policy of government and previous government, then we are effectively not to conclude, or the treaty would not be able to conclude. I'm here to say, Madam Speaker, the treaty would not be concluded if those strings were attached in that that way. And that is simply the reality, and the consequence of that, I have pointed out, will be felt in our constituents up and down the country, and it will also be felt should the opposition frontbench become the government in a few years' time, and an existential threat, or people are facing their security under threat, and they will have to make those same difficult decisions. And I gently say, and I know we have worked incredibly well together across this bench, but on this issue, it cannot be removed into some abstract debate when this is about giving tools to our law enforcement agencies to do the job on a day-to-day basis.
From this way, he's been very generous, and again, I repeat, he knows that all sides want to do exactly what he has just said. This House's job is to scrutinise, to make sure it's being done in the right way, so other parts of government policy are also upheld. He said in response to his right honourable learned friend, former Attorney General, that we shouldn't worry about this because there were European Convention obligations, and he read them out in some detail, that would prevent ministers not complying with this policy. Can he just elaborate on that for the benefit of the House? When the Home Secretary recently did not seek death penalty assurances, was that decision in line with our Convention obligations?
Well, I would refer the right honourable friend, gentleman to the ruling by the High Court and the Lord Chief Justice. And one of the grounds of challenge, well, there was a number of 5 grounds of challenge by the plaintiff, if that's the right word, and a civil challenge, were found in favour of the government. So I'm happy to have a conversation with him about it further if he reads that whole judgment. But it was certainly the case that OSJA and others were not found in conflict of our ECHR obligations or any of the other obligations. So it was also found, if my memory serves me right, that we weren't breaking our own government policy on the matter. And so I think, it has been clear. I would have to caution the House that we don't know if that judgment will be appealed, but there is a hearing related to it ongoing. So I think on that particular issue, and that is not about data, that is about broader evidence, which would remain through the MLAT process. As I've pointed out earlier, extradition is a separate process to this. This is about the data predominantly held in Facebook and Google and everything else that is so much part of the 21st century, we cannot escape the impact it has on us. Madam Deputy Speaker, if I may move now to Amendment 18, I recall the Honourable Member for Torvine tabling something similar at committee stage. I'm afraid I'm going to make the same arguments against me. Amendment 18 seeks to ensure that the terms on which other states may access electronic data held in the UK mirror the UK's own safeguard to press freedom. Forgive me, because I know I've made this point countless times. This amendment relates to incoming requests for UK-held data, when this bill is only about the UK's outgoing requests for electronic data held overseas. I completely accept the point that this bill cannot work without a reciprocal international agreement in place, but Amendment 18 is directly related to the international agreements as opposed to what our bill provides for. This bill is simply not the right place to mandate what is, I agree, a right and laudable protection for journalists and their data. We cannot impose these conditions in advance of the negotiations of an international agreement. It is not a constructive position, therefore, to tie our hands at the moment with this, but all I can say to the honourable members opposite is I absolutely hear the case for this, and also point out in the United States the First Amendment is probably one of the strongest protection of journalists that they have in the United States, and therefore that would no doubt be reflected in a treaty as well. Of course, the UK would never agree to share data with a country with insufficient safeguards, but to mandate this on the face of the bill is not at the moment necessary or helpful. Amendment 18 that seeks to control the UK government's negotiating position will not prove desirable to any government of the day. Another point that I make is I remind honourable members that they will get ample opportunity to scrutinise any international agreement when the agreement is brought before Parliament, before it can be ratified under the Constitutional Reform and Government Act process, and then again when secondary legislation is laid before Parliament, designated the agreement for the purpose of Clause 1 of the bill and under Section 52 of the Investigatory Powers Act 2016. The Government amended the bill in the other place to make clear that only agreements to which the CRAG process applies may be designated under the bill, so that in every case that scrutiny processes must be followed and members of the House get the opportunity to properly scrutinise all international agreements related to this bill before they are ratified. Let me make 2 other brief points. The first international agreement will be with the United States, as I've indicated, as the majority of CSPs are currently based there. As honourable members will know, the US places a high regard on protecting freedom of speech and freedom of press. It is enshrined in the First Amendment of their Constitution. Secondly, any additional international agreement the UK enters into in the future will, of course, be based on trust and a mutual respect for each country's adherence to principles, including the rule of law, due process and judicial oversight for obtaining and handling electronic evidence with regards to serious crime. No rational government of the day would do a deal with a country which lacked regard for the rule of law, which failed to maintain press freedom. If in the future CSPs move to countries with insufficient legal safeguards, then I highly doubt, in fact I would not be pushing the government in any way to negotiate such an agreement. And I highly doubt Parliament itself would ratify such a treaty. To summarise on this part of the amendment, Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill is not the right place, in my view, to deal with Clause 18. It's not necessary for the reasons I've outlined, and therefore the Government will not be supporting it. And I ask the honourable member to withdraw. To Amendment 9, 10 and 11. Amendment 10 seeks to make confidential journalistic data an accepted category of material for an overseas production order, meaning it cannot be sought using the powers in the bill. Amendment 9 and 11 seeks to define confidential journalistic data for the purpose of the bill. Members have previously raised concerns about confidential journalistic data in the bill. I do not want to preempt the debates we will have on other protections for journalists, which will come later, but I do believe that the concessions the Government is making in this area are appropriate and proportionate. I do not think, however, that it is right that confidential journalistic data is entirely out of reach of law enforcement agencies. As with the case with the amendment put forward at committee stage, Amendment 10 goes further than what is currently provided for in the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, PACE, while confidential journalistic material is excluded material in PACE, it is accessible if certain access conditions are met. I would also like to repeat a point I made previously. The bill has not been drafted to mirror PACE exactly. It also takes into account provisions of the Terrorism Act 2000 and the Proceeds of Crime Act 2002. The whole point of this bill is to speed up the unnecessary long drawn-out process that law enforcement agencies currently endure in order to get access to material, which helps to keep our constituents safe. Of course, this does not in any way undermine the stringent test that must be passed for an order to be granted, which will be granted in a court by a judge. The substantial value test, the public interest test, will all have to be satisfied, and we will shortly come on to inclusion of the further test, the relevant evidence test. Amendment 11 carves out journalist communication data so that the powers in the bill are not able to access it. Such an amendment is not necessary because Clause 3.4 of the bill already precludes the possibility of obtaining communications data via an overseas production order. Where the person against whom an overseas production order is sought is a telecommunications operator, the Act applies as if reference to accepted electronic data included electronic data, that is comms data. This was deliberately drafted so as to avoid overlap with the existing regime for communications data under the Investigatory Powers Act 2016. Should law enforcement agencies wish to obtain any form of communications data, journalists or otherwise, they would need to proceed using existing legislation to obtain it. To be clear, this bill does not allow for the acquisition of communications data. Madam Deputy Speaker, I agree entirely with the honourable member that journalists play a fundamental role in our society. But I would argue that these amendments are seeking is not appropriate. This bill will ensure all journalists are part of the process of applying for an overseas production order when the material sought relates to them from the outset. They uniquely will be able to make representations to the court, unlike others, so they will get the ability to make representation to be notified to the court. And I am confident that they will continue to be the case to make robust defence if they believe that it is relevant. Indeed, when working with the BBC on this legislation, one lawyer told my officials that not once in 10 years could he recall a court having overruled representations being made by them. It is important that legislation being drafted in the 21st century reflects the context of the day. The nature of journalism is evolving and law enforcement officers must be able to adapt to these changes. I therefore ask my honourable friend to withdraw Amendments 9, 10 and 11. At committee stage last month, noble colleagues across the House, in particular the Honourable Member for Torvine and the Honourable Member for Paisley and Renfrewshire North and the Honourable Member for Bexhill and Battle all expressed the concern that the tests in Clause 4 of the Bill do not fully replicate the tests under Schedule 1 of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act 1984 or PACE. Under Schedule 1 of PACE, there is a relevant evidence test as well as a substantial value and a public interest test, whereas the bill we have before us today currently includes only the substantial value and public interest test. It does not contain the relevant evidence test. I explained the position in the bill at committee. This bill does not replicate only production orders under PACE, but also those under POCA and Terrorism Offences Act 2000. Neither POCA and TAC require relevant evidence test when seeking evidence in relation to the process of crimes, which our law enforcement agencies will do with overseas production orders. Nevertheless, I promised to go away and consider the issue. My officials have discussed the issues with the operational partners. Their feedback was that relevant evidence test would neither have a preventative effect nor a negative effect to their operation. Therefore, I have included a relevant evidence test in the bill. The Government Amendments 2 and 3 are sufficient in this respect and render Amendments 13, 14 and 15 as unnecessary. I trust that introducing a relevant evidence test will satisfy honourable members' concerns in this House as well. In Amendments 4, 5, 6 and 7, on the face of the bill, that is, provisions are subject to and consistent with existing data protection framework. I'm sure members will welcome the clarification. It has also been the Government's intention to ensure that the provision of this bill involving the use of personal data be read in conjunction with and remain subject to our existing data protection framework. These proposed amendments will therefore avoid any confusion in the way that measures are interpreted. Clause 17 makes it clear that the reference to data protection legislation in Amendment 7 has the same meaning as the definition in Section 3 of the Data Protection Act 2018. That includes the General Data Protection Regulation, the 2018 Act and any regulations made under it. Honourable members may recall that Part 3 of the Data Protection Act 2018 includes specific rules for the processing of data for criminal law enforcement purposes and implements the law enforcement directives. In practice, the amendments to Clause 6 clarify that a communication service provider against whom an overseas production order is made is under no obligation to comply in any way that would, taking into account the existence of the order, contravene the requirements of the data protection legislation as defined in 2018. They also clarify that where UK law enforcement agencies receive electronic data from a common service provider following a court-approved order, they must process the data in accordance with Part 3 of the Data Protection Act. This responds to important questions about Clause 10 that were raised by peers during the passage of the bill in the other place. I hope that the clarifying these points will be welcomed by honourable members and reassure peers as well in the other House. I therefore ask honourable members to accept and support these clarifying amendments. I would also like to thank the honourable member for his contributions at committee stages on the Protection of Journalism Bill. He performs an important role as chair of the APPG for the BBC and in that capacity has played a valuable role in the discussions around the provisions relating to journalistic data in the bill. I've listened carefully to his arguments and other members and those made by across the parties and support his amendment on giving notice to journalists when journalistic data is sought. I agree that the bill should include appropriate safeguards for legitimate journalism, and I have listened carefully to the arguments as to what form those safeguards should take on the face of this legislation, while equally preventing those who might falsely pose as journalists from hiding behind the protections to which they are not entitled. The Government therefore accepts the honourable members' proposed amendments 19 to 23, which would ensure that when journalistic data is sought, the journalists themselves is put on notice of the application. This will give journalists and media outlets the opportunity, should they want to make representations to the court about whether an application for an overseas production order should be granted. While this was always the Government's intention, as you will know, our proposal was such a process to be provided for in the criminal procedure rules, the relevant rules of court for a production order. Amendment 19 to 23 will now make these notice requirements explicit on the face of the bill, so there can be no doubt about the requirement to notify a journalist of a relevant application. I recognise that this will be important. Yes, sir.
I thank the Minister for giving way, but also I thank him very much for listening to the representations that were made. As he says, I should declare an interest as Chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for the BBC. the representations from the BBC have shown that this change, of course, will make this completely consistent with the provisions under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, but also it will actually help the administration of justice, because it may mean that many applications do not actually need to be spoken against. So I just wanted to say to the Minister, I'm incredibly grateful for him for listening to us, and I think that, as he's just said, it demonstrates that he works very closely with all of us that may have ideas and that he filters those in. So, grateful, thanks.
I'm incredibly grateful to my honourable friend, and also, you know, I'm not a journalist by background. He is, I think. Well, lawyer. Well, voyeur. But what is important is it has been raised by all members of the House, the importance of protecting journalism and the freedom. And I think the balance we've struck between not excluding their material entirely, because I don't believe anyone should be above the law, no matter what profession they have, and giving them notice that other people would not have to allow them to make representations, strikes the right note. And all the way through this process, we should not forget, even in the controversial part of the bill, that this is before a judge. This is not done between officials in two administrations. These orders will be applied for in front of a court and granted by a judge. And it will be for the law enforcement agencies to satisfy the range of tests, and it will be for journalists to make their representations, and in doing so, I think it safeguards the process, but at the same time make sure that where data is needed to keep us safe, they do that.
Will you give way one more time?
Yeah.
I should also point out that, unlike the shadow frontbench, who largely, I think, supported the same amendment, the amendment that I put through was realistic to the point that if the journalist cannot be contacted, then it doesn't mean that we end the process, because ultimately what's important here is to protect victims of appalling offences. And so I think my amendment makes sure that we have that balance struck between protecting journalists, but at the same time making sure that we protect victims, which is at the core of this excellent bill.
Yes, I mean, we've put the honourable member makes a true point. You know, we've put a carve out in some areas where it's very, very urgent, you know, threat to life or something like that may be necessary, or indeed the journalist is impossible to track down, etc., and may in fact be a front for a foreign state, for example. Who knows, in a fake news or something else. So I think you know, I think all members have had genuine views about this, all well made, and you know, I'm obviously happy to accept my honourable friend's amendment, but there were many parts of the amendments that the Labour Party tabled that you know, this is not a party political point. I think it was not to do that. And so I think the exemptions get the right balance. I think we're in a place where we will be able to protect journalists, and I think we can therefore hopefully seek support of the whole House and not to move these amendments. Can I just thank, before I finish, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I apologise for the length of the opening address to all the amendments. It went from 2 groups today to 1 group, which meant I needed to obviously address everyone's amendments that had been made and deal with them as they came. I think that we've struck the right balance. It is a bill that reflects some of the challenges that we face in a day-to-day about keeping us safe, and I urge honourable members to not, I'm afraid, support the amendment put down 12 and 18 and some of the others from the opposition front bench, but I have, as I've indicated at the beginning, accepted a number of amendments from across the House throughout the passage of this bill and other bills, and that was the spirit I tried to conclude this legislation, and I hope to do so.
Designation of international agreements for purposes of Section 52 of the Investigatory Powers Act 2016.
The question is that new Clause 1 be read a second time. But before we go immediately into that debate, the House has the exciting prospect of hearing the results of the deferred divisions. The results of the deferred divisions are as follows. In respect of the question relating to consumer protection, the ayes were 309, the noes were 268, so the ayes have it. In respect of the question relating to financial services and markets, the ayes were 309, the noes were 261, so the ayes have it. In respect of the question relating to floods and water, the ayes were 310, the noes were 267, so the ayes have it. And in respect of the question relating to radioactive substances, the ayes were 309, the noes were 265, so the ayes have it. Order. The question is that new clause 1 be read a second time. Mr. Nick Thomas Simmons.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And the first thing I should point out is that I think everyone across this House wants to see a way in which the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty system is speeded up. I don't think there is any issue about that at any part of this House. The issues I will come to in a moment essentially fall into two categories. The first is on the issue of death penalty assurances, which I will deal with in a moment. The second with regard to protections for journalistic data. And I just say in relation to the intervention of the member from Bexhill and Battle, I mean, he's put out an amendment that is essentially the same as the one that I was pursuing in committee. I don't accept in any sense the difference that he is suggesting between the two, and I'm very pleased that it has been accepted and adopted by the government. Yes, and
I will apologise if I've got this wrong, but my understanding is that where the honourable member's amendment would not have included circumstances where the journalist could not be traced, whereas the amendment that I've put down actually took that into account, which meant that it wouldn't be a blocker. And I think it's in those limited aspects that our amendments differed.
Well, all I would say is that, I had discussions about that amendment and others with the Minister. They were things that we were able to come to and to compromise. And I'm trying to give him the assurance that, the idea that I was trying to do something within that to scupper the treaty is completely wrong. And I'm sure he would accept that that was the case, whatever the difference is in detail between us.
I should just say, absolutely I accept that. He will know that him and I worked very closely through the committee stage to actually make sure that the intent of what we've now got is there, and I would actually pay credit to him for actually that assistance as well.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for that and acknowledging that. And I will come to the issue of the death penalty assurances, which clearly has aroused a great deal of controversy. And just to explain really the position. Now, I would say to the Security Minister that actually new Clause 1 is an improvement. I totally accept that. The issue is a procedural one that the opposition has ended up in today because, unfortunately, by that new Clause 1 being, as it were, pushed to the head of the list to be voted upon, the only way the opposition can secure a vote on its own amendment is by voting against new Clause 1. It's just the procedural position we've ended up in. But I do say to the Minister, I do accept that it is a step forward, and I make that entirely clear from the dispatch box at the outset. Yes, I'm very.
I'm extremely grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Just to be clear on the procedure, though, his direction to Labour MPs will be to vote against new Clause 1, although he accepts it to be an improvement. If he was successful in stripping out new Clause 1 and unsuccessful in passing his own amendment, would that not put us back to a worse position?
There is always a danger. Thank you, Madam Deputy. There is always a danger, which I accept, that when we are voting on a number of amendments in a row, the order matters, and what happens on them matters. We've seen that in recent days, and I accept that point. But what I'm trying to say to my honourable friend, I'm trying to give him reassurance, in a sense, that I do accept the new Clause 1 where the duty to seek assurance is an improvement on the case that we had in the summer when no assurances were sought at all. That's certainly an improvement. But what it doesn't do is match what the position of the front bench is, that if there are circumstances, and they will be rare, when assurances are sought but not given, we say in those circumstances the data should not be handed over. That's the difference between myself and the Minister. The Minister accepts he should be going to get assurance. I will give way. Let me just finish with this first point. I will come to the Honourable Lady. And that's the difference between them. It is an improvement, but it doesn't match what our position is. I will say that.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. As a children's doctor, I have looked after a number of children who have been sexually abused, and they have sometimes very horrific physical injuries, and also, physical and mental scars. Some of the mental scars particularly can last a lifetime. I think we're all, as a House, united in wanting to be able to prevent that. Am I misunderstanding the right honourable gentleman when he says that seeking assurances is not adequate, and that if faced with a real situation where a child is in imminent danger and those assurances cannot be got, then that child should remain in danger and remain in a situation where he or she is being abused to avoid a theoretical risk of something that hasn't happened in 20 years.
I just don't accept that conception of how this works, or indeed the MLAT treaty would work, and it wouldn't work in the way that she is suggesting, I'm afraid. The point that I'm making is that in the event that assurances were not secured, and by the way, and I totally agree with the Minister that the United States looms into view because of this treaty, but this is a framework for other treaties all around the world. And the opposition is simply saying that we should be embedding into it that in the event that those assurances are not forthcoming from whichever country it is, and although we're talking about the United States here, it could be any country around the world with which this treaty could be put in place, that in those circumstances, rare though they are, the data should not be handed over. It's a simple, and by the way, I'll come to this in a moment, this has been the position for decades. I'll give way once more, but then I will need to make some progress.
Yes, thank you. I mean, but does he not accept that he is in a situation which is not perfect? What he is having to do is weigh up the risk of an actual child where abuse can be clearly seen to be happening or at risk of happening, with a theoretical possibility, which the Minister has said has not happened in 20 years, that such evidence could potentially, theoretically, possibly, at some point in the future, be used to convict somebody in a way that may or may not ultimately end in the death penalty. And that this real child will end up being further abused while this data is waited for.
No, I don't accept that at all. And what I would say to the Honourable Lady is this. She talks about theoretical possibilities. These will be actual cases. Actual cases, not theoretical. I'll give you once more, but I do...
for the Shadow Minister giving way, but does he accept, despite the fact that this is not about extradition, it is about data exchange, the fact that these are heinous crimes that this would incorporate this Act, that the threshold for death penalty, both at state and federal level, is actually far higher. The bar is higher.
Yes, is the answer to that question. It is significantly higher, obviously, and the cases will be extraordinarily rare. And that's what everybody says who has looked at it. And that's why... This is generally the last time.
I'm very grateful. He's been very generous, more than generous. I'm very grateful. But on the issue of assurance, does he also accept, he thinks logically, so if those assurances were given and were not actually fulfilled, then future assurances would not obviously carry the same weight as previous assurances that were carried through?
I honestly can't imagine a situation that the Honourable Gentleman is saying where a country that gave those assurances didn't stand by it, but would undermine the whole system if that were the case. But I do need to make some progress now. I hope Honourable Members will realise I've been generous giving way to members opposite. We absolutely agree, as I said, with speeding up the mechanism, but we believe that in this framework, which will be a framework in which many reciprocal treaties will be plugged in the years to come, that we should make our clear opposition to the death penalty in all circumstances clear. Now, the Security Minister has spoken about the United States, and I appreciate that that's where data is held, much data. I also appreciate that that's the treaty that is being negotiated, as it were, at the moment. But firstly, let's just have a look what practice is. It is obvious that the United States would expect us to require full death penalty assurances prior to sharing this information. It routinely complies with that requirement. It's long been the case under the 1994 Treaty of Mutual Legal Assistance in Criminal Matters that now exists, that the seeking and securing of assurances is commonplace. And what the opposition is trying to put into law is what has been the norm for decades. Now, he makes the point, the Minister, about his judgment as to whether or not the US would wish to conclude a treaty in those circumstances, in the circumstances that the House passed the amendment that the opposition has put forward. And I just want to examine this because I do think the recent High Court judgment in El Ghazouli, which has been published in recent days, is instructive in this regard. And it's very rare that we do see government papers in the public domain so soon after a particular decision is taken. And this is because in July of last year, the House became aware of correspondence between the Home Secretary and the then United States Attorney General that the government had not sought death penalty assurances at all. Now, let me be clear, first of all, that we on these benches absolutely condemn the actions of the so-called foreign fighters, and that's why I've worked with the Minister to put the designated areas of fence onto the statute book. I've done that, and we now have it. It isn't quite on our statute book yet, but it will be in due course. And I made various suggestions about that, as the Minister knows, that have eventually been incorporated into the bill. We supported that principle, and it will be on the statute book. But the fact is that that matter did lead to a court case, which is instructive about, I would suggest, Ministers' decision-making. And I go back to one of the earlier interventions. It isn't about the naked partisan politics of it. These are very serious issues upon which members on all sides of this House have very strongly held opinions, and I respect whatever those perspectives are. But what did come forward from that case in the summer was a number of things. Now, the UK Embassy in Washington was asked what was the likely response from the US administration if the UK were to seek full or partial assurances on the death penalty. They were asked that question. And this is the response. Parts of the US machinery, notably Korea Department of Justice officials, would not be surprised if we asked for death penalty assurances. It is what they expect of us. And that, I would suggest, is what I've said a moment or two ago. It is then added, but this doesn't go for senior political levels of this administration. At best, they will think we have tin ears. At worst, they will wind the President up to complain to the PM and potentially to hold a grudge. Now, that is a worrying thing to see, obviously, and that wouldn't be a way to run any negotiation. And it's no surprise, really, that the Foreign and Commonwealth Office gave strong advice to seek an assurance. It was cited as the government's consistent policy over many years, which has been maintained without exception, and I appreciate the one point that was made in an intervention to me by the Minister. There may be an exception. I accept that, but this is what the advice was saying. Maintained without exception and without difficulty in cooperating with allies such as the US, they agreed that a sole exception would undermine the UK's consistent and total opposition. And this is what the Foreign and Commonwealth Office said about this in the summer. Her Majesty's Government seeks a comprehensive assurance that the suspects will not be subject to the death penalty. This is critical to the consistency with which we apply Her Majesty's Government's policy on overseas security and justice assistance. Were we not to apply this practice to this case, it could undermine all future efforts to secure effective written death penalty assurances from the US authorities for future UK security and justice assistance. The exception made for the US in this case could also undermine future attempts to secure similar assurances from other countries with which we will have a security relationship, particularly if it seems likely that there is litigation which leads to the disclosure of the level of assurance. It could leave Her Majesty's Government open to accusations of Western hypocrisy and double standards, which would undermine Her Majesty's Government's death penalty policy globally, including in the United States. I'll finish this point. I will give way. I do think that the Foreign Office officials were correct, and I wish the ministers had listened in the summer. And this is a point, as the Security Minister knows, that was a subject to an urgent question to which he responded, I think, some months ago. But I will give way.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Member. I wonder if he will quote at length my response in that court case and the response of the Home Secretary and indeed the other parts of the correspondence. He makes the point about the embassy. The embassy in the United States is a foreign office, is the other part of the foreign office. And he may like to reflect that, first of all, we won on all 5 counts, so he has picked a few parts of the case but not the full page. And he will also know that one of the, under the policy and the previous policy, strong reasons, there is, you cannot seek assurances under strong reasons. One of the strong reasons, a bit like some of the challenges around this, which is data, but that he's referring to an MLAT case, is that the alternatives for these individuals, and he talks about hypocrisy, for their rights, but I get that, but he raises hypocrisy, the alternatives for those individuals were very much less of their rights, potentially extrajudicial killing in the back of the head, potentially being shipped to Guantanamo, that we fundamentally object to and oppose to, and in that case pointed out we would not assist in. The alternatives for their human rights was far, far worse than a lawful trial in the United States.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm not disputing the outcome of the case. The outcome is very clear. It actually goes back to the earlier point I was making about New Clause 1, because clearly it isn't in primary legislation at the moment that there is a duty to seek assurances. What I would say to the Minister looking at that case, and I'm not questioning the genuine nature of what he does or whether his decision-making, but what I would say is that in that case, against that backdrop, no assurances were sought at all. Now, the Minister set out the reasons for that. I've heard the reasons that he's given, but that is the brutal reality of what happened in that case against the backdrop of the advice that I have read out to the House. Now, I would also add that more widely, governments across the piece, this government, the coalition government, previous Labour governments, have on numerous occasions sought to promote the UK's opposition to the use of the death penalty around the world. And there are multiple examples of where governments on all sides have sought to avoid any complicity with the use of capital punishment and argued around the world for its abolition. In fact, the Prime Minister herself said in the House on 31st of October last year, "Our long-standing position on the death penalty is well known. We call for its abolition globally." And we say the same on these benches. Now, I could go through a number of examples, but there are examples of where we've, as a country, agreed that it's highly undesirable that drugs used by some states in the United States for the purpose of execution could have been sourced here. We've decided not to fund counter-narcotics operations in Iran because of the risk that it could lead to the use of the death penalty. The Prime Minister herself, actually, as Home Secretary, when Pakistan resumed executions after a long moratorium, triggered a review of all security engagement as a consequence of that. And indeed, the government back in October 2016 withdrew a bid to provide offender management services to Saudi Arabian prisons, again on that issue around the death penalty. And of course, the UK will not export products for use in capital punishment. So that, absolutely, and that is the well-established position. And the well-established position, too, is the seeking and securing of assurances. I'll make some progress now. I did give the Honourable Gentleman 3 tries later. Now, what I'm just simply saying is not to move away from that norm and send any kind of signal, because this bill, in any event, goes far beyond America. I appreciate the point the Minister makes about data and where it's held at present, but of course, as the internet continues to evolve, other countries will hold more data as well. Now, the Security Minister has often said in committee that he would only negotiate treaties with countries that shared our respect for the rule of law, and I don't disbelieve him for a moment. But of course, he isn't going to be the Security Minister forever. And in those circumstances, we have to, I say, put the assurance in this framework now. So our position is that opposition to the death penalty has been a bipartisan UK government position for over half a century. Since 1965, when the work of many across this House, including the remarkable Sidney Silverman, came to fruition, this Parliament has stood as a beacon of common human values, promoting the abolition of the death penalty across the globe. We say for us as a country to continue to stand tall in the world and to use our considerable soft power, which we must, we always have to hold ourselves to the highest standards. And put very simply, for us to credibly argue for the abolition of the death penalty in other countries, we cannot be complicit ever in its application ourselves. And I ask that we send that strong moral signal to the world today. Now, it seems an odd move from there to start talking now about these very technical issues of confidential journalistic data, important though they are. But that is, of course, where we're left, because this whole set of amendments has been grouped together. So I do want to deal with that now and deal with some of the issues that the Honourable Gentleman for Bexhill and Battle raised as well. And I should say that in general terms, I am pleased with the government's direction of travel on these issues, but there are still some real causes of concern. Now, I am pleased with the movement on Amendments 19 and 20, which have been referred to earlier in the debate. The notification requirement extends now to all journalistic data, which I think is to be welcomed. There was a concern that if we were distinguishing between confidential data and non-confidential data, that some wouldn't be covered. So that, I think, is to be welcomed, as is the genuine notification requirement that specifically includes the journalist, which is in Amendment 20, I think, of the Honourable Gentleman's offering. There are still some concerns about this that I hope the Security Minister will be able to take on board and listen to going forward, though I do broadly welcome it. In 2B of the new proposed Clause 12, there is an override of this requirement where it would prejudice investigations into indictable offences and terrorism investigations. Now, I accept that emergency overrides are necessary. I totally accept that, and you would expect to see that in this bill and indeed other similar types of bill. There is, though, I think, quite a low threshold in this. Prejudicing a terrorism investigation, I totally accept, may well constitute an emergency. But prejudicing an investigation into an indictable offence, I do think, is extremely broad, because indictable offences are a huge category of offences, indicating, of course, they can only be tried on indictment, but I think that does draw this extremely widely. So there is a path, I think, by which the police could access confidential data still without notifying the journalist. Now, under the Terrorism Act 2000, and I think the Minister has openly said that a number of provisions here are drawn on the Terrorism Act and the Proceeds of Crime Act. That can happen in terrorism investigations, but I think there is a concern about some of this most sensitive data being accessed without notice. And whilst it is not my intention to push Amendment 10 to a vote at the end of these proceedings, I did raise in that amendment confidential journalistic data, or at least some of it, simply being beyond the reach of the police. And whilst I appreciate the government's position on this, I do think that a consideration as to the breadth of this to cover all indictable offences is a concern, and something that we do need to give deep consideration to going forward as to how that might work in practice. If something which is meant, and I know it is, knowing the Honourable Member of Bexhill and Battle, I think it is genuinely meant to produce a situation of safeguards within the bill, what we wouldn't want to do is construct a path which somehow becomes the norm, as opposed to something that is meant to actually be the exception within the amendment that's been put down. On Amendment 18, I do part company with the Minister. Now, Amendment 18 I do think is important because it obtains guarantees for freedom of expression in reciprocal treaties. And here I do draw on what the Foreign Secretary said only a few months ago, actually. He was writing in the London Evening Standard 1st of November and said, and I quote, "Defending a free media must therefore be a central element of British foreign policy, in keeping with our country's role as an invisible chain linking the nations to share our values." And the point that the Minister made is really a technical point on this, because he talks about both incoming and outgoing data. But of course, this system of overseas production orders is meant to work together with treaties with countries which will in themselves be reciprocal. And I say that Amendment 18 would be totally in line with what the Foreign Secretary said. It would really be pushing our position as a beacon in the world of press freedom, and saying that we would not be able, first of all, to countenance a treaty with a country that didn't have those similar levels of press freedoms, nor would we wish to have a situation where another country without the same level of press freedom as us somehow has this back door to access our data. So I do differ with the Minister on Amendment 18. I appreciate we differ in the very emotive issues that we've discussed earlier. But I do want to finish on a more consensual note, because I do appreciate too the move on relevant evidence that the Minister has made, which I think is to be praised, and also the introduction in the bill very clearly of the data protection regulation, which I also think provides important safeguards. So on this particular issue of confidential journalistic data, I do welcome the progress that has been made and do say to the Minister that I hope that throughout the passage of the bill we've shared aims and tried to work towards them.
Gavin Newlands.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think throughout the passage of this bill and of other bills where we've engaged with the Security Minister and the Honourable Member for Torvine, we've had a collaborative approach, and it's again the case at report stage. But as the Minister himself said, it's that we've had a constructive relationship with the Minister, which is why I was quite disappointed with the change in tone this afternoon, questioning the opposition's motives and accusing us of essentially protecting paedophiles. Every member in this House, as the point has already been made, every member in this House would like to see these despicable criminals convicted, but we have to ensure that legislation is passed with adequate protections for the human rights which we are obligated to protect under the ECHR, and I would hope the Minister would perhaps reflect on that. In Amendment 12, as the Honourable Member for Torvine has set out in granular detail, and for the sake of the House, I will not seek to repeat that process. It seeks to avoid the UK being complicit in allowing for the death penalty to be practised abroad using our data provided here. Previously, we've heard from the Government that this would amount to dragging a horse and cart through the bill, but this is a matter of principle that the SNP will simply never compromise on. As we've heard other members refer to it, we're obviously a signatory to the European Convention of Human Rights, of which Article 2 and Protocol 139 provides for the complete abolition of the death penalty. And as I've said in the past, I deeply regret that the Government resisted this amendment and from the Lords and took it out in committee, but pleased that we've got another opportunity to put this anti-death penalty provision back on the face of the bill today. It's not just our responsibilities under the Convention, but this Government's own policy of opposing the death penalty in all circumstances as a matter of principle, which is setting itself against in opposing this amendment. Moreover, in response to a written question, Baroness Annally said, "There has been no change in the British Government's policy of working towards global abolition of the death penalty. This Government pursues human rights and their universality, a more ambitious and coherent approach in focusing on a small number of single issues. Our commitment to the rules-based international order underpins this work, including through bilateral and multilateral support to global efforts to abolish the death penalty." And as signatories of the Convention, we really should do everything in our power to avoid in compliance with the use of the death penalty abroad. The UK at least claims to be a modern liberal democracy and a champion of human rights the world over. Opposing this particular amendment is entirely contradictory to those claims. The Government has frequently refused to provide countries with aid and assistance where it is judged that this assistance could result in the use of capital punishment by the recipient party. For example, the review of the UK security engagement when Pakistan resumed use of the death penalty, declining to assist with services in Saudi Arabian prisons where juveniles were sentenced to the death penalty. Alongside this, the UK will not export products, as we've heard, for use in capital punishment, for instance, the medicines for lethal injections in the US. It would be inconsistent, not to mention a grave disregard for human rights, for the Government to refuse to supply the drugs for US executions while providing the very information which made that execution possible. The US also already expects the UK to require full death penalty assurances prior to the sharing of information and routinely complies with this requirement. For example, in the recent ISIS Beatles case, when the FCO's strong advice was to seek a full death penalty assurance, this was cited at the time as the Government's consistent policy, which has been maintained without exception and without difficulty in cooperating with allies such as the US. They agreed that a sole exception would undermine the UK's consistent and total opposition. Also, no evidence has been presented as to the unwillingness from the US to engage in data sharing arrangements where death penalty assurances are required. Without clear evidence to this effect, it is difficult to accept the Government's proposition that the US would walk away from the negotiating table for that reason. New Clause 1, while we welcome as an improvement, simply doesn't go far enough. It's restricted to a requirement for assurances in the context of Section 52 of the IPA. And, however, data could be requested by another state through a different route, which does not require active interception on the part of the UK. And in those circumstances, our concern on these benches would be that the protection simply wouldn't operate. Yes, I'll go.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman giving way, and the Shadow Minister earlier gave a litany of examples, rightly so, where the government has set out to abolish the death penalty worldwide. He's just referred to assurances on ISIS cases and other assurances. So I'm just a little puzzled, given that we've heard from the Shadow Minister, we've heard from him that assurances have been sought previously, why that should change.
Well, I think the member for his intervention, well, words are great, it's deeds that are important, and we think this should be on the face of this bill. This bill is, to use the Minister's terms, the docking station for future agreements, so therefore we think it should be on the face of this bill, which sets the tone and the regulations for future agreements. I'll give way once more.
Very generous, I'm grateful. So perhaps to help the House and help me, and I need all the help I can get, could he give an example of where assurances have not been sought in such cases?
But that is not the point. It's about the principles. We've spoken at length. You've just listed some of them. It's the principles, and we are signatories to the ECHR as well. We should ensure that these principles and obligations are on the face of this bill. Otherwise, in my view, we're not fulfilling those obligations. Amendment 1, tabled by the Liberal Democrats, is obviously an improvement on new clause 1. My only small concern, and we probably may address this in a speech, it might not cover instances where data could be requested by another state through a different route, again similar to new clause 1, which, the issues with new clause 1 I've just set out. Amendment 12 simply refers to where the treaty provides for requests, therefore provides the most comprehensive level of protection. And I would urge members from across the House to back this amendment, as I think our international reputation may well be degraded even further, in fact, as possible given the Brexit situation at the moment, if we were to enable this barbaric practice anywhere else in the world. And that brings me on to journalistic protections. I very much welcome the amendments that tabled by the Government and our member for Bexhill and Battle. But they still don't go far enough. Those amendments are fine in of themselves, but there are other areas of journalistic protection that still need to be looked at. Yes, I'll give him.
To him, just ask him this. If he was sitting where I am, and he had the choice before him, and the United States administration said, look, here's the deal. We've got 90%, 99%, or whatever it is of the data. You've got 1%. We haven't got equality of arms. This is the deal. You either take it without the strings attached, or you do. And if there's no deal, there's no treaty, as that amendment would do, what would you do?
Well, I think that's almost a false choice he's painting, a black and white issue. At the end of the day, on an issue like this of such grave importance as the death penalty, I would bring it to the House and seek the House's view. It wouldn't be for me to try and override our principles as set out in the ECHR. And that may well be the case. It might be the USA and they may well hold all the data. But if we don't hold to our principles, then what is the point?
Absolutely.
So that is our view. But clause 12, as it stands, provides for journalists to be given notice of and made a party to an application that pertains to the confidential journalistic material, but as we've heard, it doesn't apply to non-confidential, but nonetheless extremely sensitive journalistic material, which, as I said in Bill Committee, is at odds with the domestic situation as outlined in PACE. The system proposed in the bill will allow for significantly reduced opportunity for journalists to engage in arguments about what is and is not suitable for disclosure, removing the opportunity for our journalists to make submissions on the issues that this gives rise to in the context of their work. So we believe, as I've set out, the bill doesn't provide adequate protection of confidential journalistic material. This could seriously threaten journalistic inquiry and prevent the free press from doing their job. The implications that this could have on our democracy is very worrying. We're not alone in sharing these concerns. The BBC and many others raised deep concerns with this section of the bill. Amendment 18 is essential as it ensures that any protections afforded to our journalists in this bill are not simply domestic, but ensure other states the government enters into agreement with must mirror the UK's own press safeguards. Now, Government Amendment 19, 23, tabled with the Honourable Member for Bexon Battle, would ensure that there is a requirement that notice must be given to all applications for journalistic material. It is vital that journalists can operate freely in the knowledge that the Government cannot just seize their information on a whim. As I said, we very much welcome those amendments. However, I would just echo the concerns aired by the Labour Front bench on section 2B, and in particular the indictable offence override. I hope the Minister, in the summing up, can give us some comfort, if he can, on that particular section. Under this bill, journalists would have a significantly reduced ability to engage in arguments about what is and is not suitable for disclosure, removing the opportunity for them to make submissions as to the issues this gives rise to. But in conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, there has been clear improvements in this bill, and we very much welcome these concessions, but ultimately New Clause 1 and some of the journalistic protections, despite the addition of the amendments we've discussed by the Honourable Member for Bexon Battle, simply don't go far enough, and that's why we were backing the amendments tabled by the Honourable Member for Turbine.
Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This overall is a very good bill. It's much needed, it's not controversial, and that's why we won't be seeking division wanting to vote against it at third reading. But I think the debates we've seen already show that there's a chance to improve this bill. We've seen from the amendments from the Honourable Member for Bexhill and Battle that backbenchers have been able to improve this bill, and we will strongly support his amendments. And I know the BBC support them, and I think they're very well judged. I actually also support Amendment 18 from the Labour front bench, because I think trying to ensure that protections for journalism and free expression are in the treaties, I think, is what we would expect. I mean, it's not unreasonable, and I think the world would expect Britain to uphold that. And I think we can hopefully get some agreement on those across the House. It's a shame we've got this disagreement, however, on the death penalty assurances. And I just want to make just a brief few remarks on that. I know the Minister has been trying to reach out, but he'll know that New Clause 1 only is about seeking assurance, not receiving assurances, which is the issue that I think is at real heart of this disagreement. In intervening on the Minister, I talked about whether or not there'd been discussions about a carve-out for these types of offences that we're aware about. I'd have thought that would be incredibly easy, because the number of death penalty executions are tiny. The number of cases that will result in that are tiny. And therefore, I would have thought the US, very practical people, would accept a treaty with that carve-out. And the amendments that we've tabled, that the Labour team have tabled, would enable that carve-out to be pushed forward, it seems to me. And I don't think that's actually unreasonable. And I would say to him very gently that he talks about the inequality of arms. And obviously we get that. America's rather bigger than us, and we all know the rest. But I would also press him that it's not just them doing us a favour. We have data to offer them too. Maybe only 1%, but they want it. They want to catch their criminals. They want to catch the bad guys too. We've got a great record of working with them, and I think we should continue that. So I don't just think it is as one-sided as he portrayed. And let's also remember what we're trying to achieve here. There are a huge number of people in Congress and across America who are campaigning to get rid of the death penalty. We've now got 19 US states that no longer have the death penalty, and 6 of those have changed their laws since 2007 because of campaigning, so it's been really successful. And that's one of the reasons why I actually think we have a principle here we should stand up for, because actually this debate is live in the US, and for us to send this signal, I think is important for US citizens, not just the people we're talking about. Let's remember, in addition to those states who've got rid of the death penalty, Madam Deputy Speaker, 11 other states have not executed anyone for 10 years, and effectively de facto, so that's 30 states. The federal government, acting as a federal government, have not executed anyone since 2003. So I think the idea we're pushing at some door that's really closed, and there's a massive opposition in the US political system, I just don't think that's true. The facts do not bear that out. I'm happy to give way.
He makes a valid point. He also highlights how very rare it is. I mean, which slightly goes to the point about, you know, that balance. Look, this is not just about specifically the death penalty choice. This is about the United States administration saying, look, you can't have your cake and eat it. You want all this help. You want all this data. You want us to take back foreign fighters and try them. You want us to do all this. And no sooner do we say yes, then we start telling you how to do it, and you hear the conditions and everything else. That is part of the overall assessment that the government took in some other cases, and in this case, where the data, last 20 years now, that never been an issue. That is why the judgment has been and why the clear message from the United States administration is that would jeopardise the treaty.
I hear what the Minister says, and I know he knows there's not a huge amount between us, because we're all trying to get to the same objectives. But the points he makes could be argued against the United States position, and I think because we are close allies, we could close that gap. You know, I mean, I don't think it would be terribly great for senators to oppose this bill, obviously because they have Senate ratification, when they would be held to account by their citizens for getting in the way of sharing information to catch paedophiles. As a British politicians here on all sides, including the Minister, I think we should stand up for British principles. And yes, to catch these appalling criminals, but also to make sure that we advance justice and human rights. I do not think we should see them as separate and see them deal with them separately. I think we can bring them together. And I think it would be a very good step for this House to stand up for this principle that we all share. That is government policy. That's been government policy for a long time. And say to our close friends in the United States that we believe we can come to some agreement. And he made clear in his response that the treaty is still in development. The Honourable Member for Torfaen, in his comments, he talked about there being a lot of people in the United States, particularly the State Department, who are expecting us to make this. They're actually expecting us to make this. So it's not unreasonable that we do, Madam Deputy Speaker. So I hope the Minister, who is, you know, highly respected across this House and whose bill we utterly support, can understand why we are trying to make this extra push, actually is to help him in his negotiations. Thank you.
John Woodcock.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Listening to this debate so far, I found myself nodding along with the Shadow Minister, as often I do, and on his very well-honed speech about the bipartisan approach which has long been taken in regard to the death penalty and to the UK's opposition to it on both sides. And then I tried to reconcile it with what I believe is his party's position, which is actually to oppose new clause 1, which I was agreeing with what he was saying. I think I have some sympathy, because I'm afraid that the reasoned approach which he characteristically takes at the front bench is just not, it seems, matched by the diktat which comes down from the Shadow Home Secretary and the leader of his party, because we end up in a position, and I have to say to the Shadow Home Secretary, she has ended up in a position for the second time this week where I and others are further to the left than her on a key issue. I was sat behind her on Monday night where she was explaining to the House why it was right to abstain on the immigration bill. And now it seems we are going to have a situation where the Lords have rightly, and in a way that is welcome, forced a concession from the government. New Clause 1 does seem substantive to me in writing onto the face of a bill the requirement for this and any future government to seek assurances on the death penalty, which is an approach that is rightly being said has long been practised, but was, in terms of extradition, in a way that was quite troubling, was disregarded over the instance of Mohammed Emwazi and others. But we've got this. we've got this situation where this new Clause 1 has been laid by, after pressure from the Lords. It is a step forward in legally codifying opposition to the death penalty. And as I understand it, the Labour Party is going to try to force its members of Parliament to vote against that, in the hope that they will then get to an amendment which would be unworkable and would indeed wreck the chance of a treaty. I think the Minister has convincingly set out. But assuming that new Clause 1 goes through, because I certainly will be voting against it, and I'm encouraging many as my Labour voting for it, and I'm encouraging as many of my Labour colleagues to vote for it or to abstain. So assuming that goes through, we're not going to get, is my understanding, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the Labour amendment by which they appear to be setting store. And I'm afraid that that epitomises the deep oppositional politics which has always been the hallmark of the Shadow Home Secretary, of the leader of the opposition. And it is an example of why I'm afraid that it would be so deeply troubling for the nation if they were given the chance to actually stand at the other dispatch and have the authority to act as Home Secretary and Prime Minister. But I would say, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this week does seem to have been another week where precedents are changing in this House. And as I understand it now, the Labour whip is no longer binding on MPs of either the backbench or the front bench. And it does seem to be possible for Labour MPs, Labour front bench MPs, to break their own whip and remain in the front bench. I don't know if it is a requirement to go and sit in the smoking room in order to be exempt from what would otherwise be the strictures of the front bench. But it does mean, actually, that Labour MPs who are otherwise being forced into the position of seeking this false choice between human rights, which we have to uphold as a country, which if we do not uphold, the law will bring the government into line, as it may yet do over the case of these so-called ISIS beetles. But they are forcing a choice between this incredibly important action in gaining the treaty to speed up action against paedophiles, action potentially to be able to convict British terrorists. They are forcing their MPs to choose one or the other. It is a false choice, and it's one which MPs, I hope, will reject and vote for new Clause 1, so actually we can go ahead with a strengthened bill which the country needs.
Minister.
Madam Deputy Secretary, with the leave of the House, the amendments have been well heard and well argued, and I think in following the Honourable Member for Barrow Furness, it is true it is a false choice. You know, this is real. This is about giving power to our law enforcement agencies to get data only, not the wider MLAT evidential packages that already are guided by the overseas justice guidance, nor is it about extradition. It is simply about recognising the 21st century we live in, where the data is stored and the vital need for us to get it. And it is just wrong to tie it up with Trumpian ideology or anything else. It's not true. It started under President Obama. The Shadow Home Secretary May makes a note. It's not us kowtowing to President Trump at all. It is a suggestion from our allies that would help us cut the time from years and months to getting vital data that we need to protect our children and protect us from terrorism, going from months and days. I'll give way quickly.
I'm grateful to the Minister of State giving way. And can I reach out to the opposition and somebody who's joint chairman of the all-party parliamentary group for the abolition of the death penalty? I, like the Shadow Minister, did have some concerns, and I've addressed them with the Minister, and he's listened, and I think the government have listened. And I would appeal to the Shadow Minister and the front bench to think again. in the national interest and in the interests of victims?
Thank you. I'm grateful to my honourable friend, who has campaigned against the death penalty for very many years and, as co-chair of the all-party group, knows a thing or two about it. And I don't think he would say it lightly if he did not feel it. And I think I heard my shadow make some points about the judgment on the Beatles case, which is not, of course, related specifically to this data, but makes the point about exceptional circumstances. And I urge him to read it in full. Well, then he is quoted so selectively. If he has read it in full, he will have known that all 5 points of allegation, but he didn't expand on how important, because in expanding them in full, he would have said, for example, that the Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales made it very clear that government recognises and responds to the realities of political lives in the state concerned. Whether or not it likes those realities, it would be very odd indeed to ignore them. Ministers, diplomats and other officials are engaged in a constant process of evaluation, making judgments about the differences about what is said, what is meant, between what is threatened, explicitly or implicitly, and what is likely to happen, about the impact of action of the UK. This is what was done here. The Home Secretary had the advice of the British Ambassador. The suggestion that he was not entitled to take into account and rely on the expert assessment when making his own judgment is misconceived. The Lord Chief Justice recognises the political realities we operate in the course of trying to keep people safe in this nation. It is a great shame that the Shadow Home Secretary doesn't manage to recognise those realities when he can. I beg to...
Ready?
The question is that new clause 1 be read a second time. As many as that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Division! Clear the lobby. Order. The question is that new clause 1 be read a second time. As many as that opinion, say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Aye. Tellers for the ayes. Tellers for the ayes. Amanda Milling and Rebecca Harris. Tellers for the noes. Jeff Smith and Bamos Charalambu.